Okay, we're live.
Okay. Oh, I should.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. And I just say good morning. I guess that's. But Nuri is going to, present on the national security strategy document that just came out. In light of her essay on civilization, which appeared about 2 years ago. And the significance of this is deeper than what the document says, but it has garnered attention, for example, from Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, and of course, from us, when they talked about in the document, civilizational erasure in Europe. But everybody said, well, what do they mean by civilization, and so on. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Nuri. I think she's best able to explain all of this.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Security Strategy document itself, some of its contents, and then really, I think Free School's concept of civilization as we've been developing it and refining it over the last 5 to 10 years, and I think why it's important to get it right, basically. And so this National Security Strategy document was finalized in November, and it was released last week. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of news headlines. I feel like there are probably 5 different articles in the New York Times, 3 or 4 in the New York Times, Financial Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy. Everybody's kind of going crazy over it. And I think, to my memory, other national security strategy documents don't get the same amount of attention because I didn't even know really what it was. But basically, it's a report that's mandated by the Department of Defense Reorganization Act, and it only came about in 1986. And so the point of it is it's basically a vision statement for the president to communicate to Congress that this is what the executive branch sees as the national security vision. And so legislation should follow these proposed ideas. And so it discusses international interests, the commitments, the policies, and basically a defense plan that would be necessary to execute the security plans that are presented. And so nothing is legally binding. It's really just a vision statement of strategy. And I think if you think about who has actually been in power since the 1980s, it's Reagan, H.W. Bush, Clinton, W. Bush, Obama, and then Trump, Biden, and then now Trump again. And I was looking back at some of the older ones, and this one definitely is different from the previous ones. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But like Doc was saying, the flashpoint and the top line media coverage is just that Europe faces civilizational erasure. And elsewhere in the document, it also says that Europe is facing economic decline, political crisis, and a lack of self-confidence. And it's very clear on that. And I thought that was interesting because partially what the vision statement needs to do is it needs to say, this is what our priorities are, but then at the same time, this document also functions as basically ideological projection, where it can't say anything bad. It can't really say anything bad about the state of American security or the state of America in the world. But I thought that a lot of the projection of what it's accusing Europe of being is actually an assessment of where the US is as well. And so, let's see. And so one of the articles was called Trump's America and the Clash of Civilizations Within Europe by Gideon Rockman. And Doc and I had texted a little bit back and forth. And Rockman's assessment, I think, is more ideologically interesting than some of the other ones, where it says that the interesting thing that it's trying to do that is ambitious is redefining national security in civilizational terms. And it also says that the document is much more passionate and energetic when it's actually talking about civilization. It's not really very interested in the democracy, the liberal democracy framing that is basically the incessant drumbeat for the past ones that I looked at. Yeah, and so and then the article also says the Trump administration view of Western civilization is based on race, Christianity and nationalism. The European version is a liberal view founded on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, including international law. And so what I thought was interesting about that is that even Gideon Rockman is asking, what is civilization and what is Western civilization based on? Like, what actually anchors civilization? Is it ideas? Is it a political framework? Is it a philosophical framework? Or is it, like race, blood mixture, something like religion or nationalism? And so in general, like just reading the national security strategy for the first time, it's written in the typical Trump way. So it's very like bombastic and self-aggrandizing. But the table of contents is a lot more straightforward than Joe Biden's. It's much more simple, broad in general, where previous ones are somewhere between like 30 and 60 pages. And the Biden ones are much more, there are a bunch more like subheadings where it's saying like, this is how we want to balance the Asian Pacific. This is the state of our alliance in Europe. This is our investment in Africa's future, stuff like that. Whereas Trump's is just like, what is American strategy? How American strategy went astray? And then what should the United States actually want? What do we want? What do we want in the world? What do we want from the world? How do we get what we want? And so I thought that, and then the way that it breaks down the strategies is just principles, priorities, and then maybe a few pages on each of the different regions in the world. And let's see. And so I think in that sense, like it's much more directly communicated and it's also kind of refreshing, but in the writing of it, it's kind of incoherent. In different places, you can tell that a lot of different people worked on it and they haven't really settled on like the tone I think they want to take. Where, let's see, one of the things that like I actually started laughing when I was reading it was that they're saying that our goal should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. We need a strong Europe to help us compete and work with like different people to prevent adversaries from dominating Europe. But then it says America is, understandably, sentimentally attached to the European continent, and of course to Britain and Ireland. And it's like, what does that have to do with our national security strategy? And also, what does Ireland have to do with our sentimental attachment, like as the United States? And so I think stuff like that is kind of like, what is it doing in here? Like, who approved it, and what is the point of that being there? And I think in that sense, like in the reading of it, there is sort of a grand vision of like 1776, like our roots back to England and Europe, and then also the waves of white immigration from Europe. Like we owe Europe a lot in that respect. And there's this sort of, like white imaginary of like what we feel like Europe should be, and this discomfort with like Europe's demographics changing because of migration. And again, I think the document is much more comfortable with sort of using Europe as a lens to like analyze, these are the problems going on with like Western civilization or like European civilization. Because I think for the national security thing, it doesn't want to say that American civilization or American society is in crisis. I think it's invested in saying that actually America's big, Europe's the problem. And my overall impression is that this strategy is a really big break from the previous ones, like the Biden, the Obama ones, which all center Asia, whether it's countering China and Russia or rebalancing towards the Middle East or the Pacific region. And that's, I'll talk more about like why that is important, but that doesn't mean that the strategy itself actually is like coherent ideologically. And I think one of the big differences is that the previous ones really relied on this emphasis on spreading liberal democracy being the best possible system. And that's why America is superior. That's why like we're able to do all the things that we can do. And on the other hand, I feel like Trump is not that interested in democracy. He even says, I think, we're fine with working with countries that are not necessarily democratic if we can cooperate on the basis of like economics or on like markets and stuff like that. Like also, I think specifically with Saudi Arabia. But I think you can tell that there are a lot of different people in the mix who are writing this document who have different sort of ideological emphases and different priorities, whether it's like this paranoia about blood mixture, this desire to like reindustrialize, this like thought of spheres of influence and stuff like that. And yeah, one of the ideological architects is like Michael Anton, I think. And so he was in the administration, but he left. And that's like, he's like one of the people who comes up when you actually look up who wrote it. And the other interesting thing is that he's literally Italian and Lebanese. So it's just like, what is this? Where is this coming from? And so, let's see. And so like just top level, I think what is worthwhile from this memorandum is that it's not obsessed with being the supreme hegemon of the entire world. It's not really operating like the America like is the end of history and America will be the best forever and ever and ever, which I think was kind of the tone of the last few memorandums and security strategies. And like I said, it is less obsessed with centering Asia and opposing China and Russia. And rather it's moving towards, at least in word, focusing on the North American hemisphere and sort of going to the spheres of influence thing, where basically I think it acknowledges a multipolar world and it acknowledges multiple like strong regional powers. And I think its aspirations are for America to stay in that mix and to basically focus on its strengths. And then the other things that it talks a lot about is like energy and industry, so an emphasis on production, and then an emphasis on innovation and confidence, which I see as like basically the spirit or the ideals that should define America. And yeah, and so the strategy is not just about civilization. Like it uses civilization as a concept, but I would not say that the overall framework is just purely civilizational. Whereas I think for the essay that I had written for Avant-Garde, like Doc said, I wrote it 2 years ago, and we have like been talking about civilization, and I think that's one of the prime categories that the Free School is actively developing. And so when I wrote that article, I wanted to try to build on it theoretically as an actual category to try to define like, this is what we mean by civilization, this is why it's important. And most importantly, I think that civilization is not like a open and shut sort of descriptor, but it's something that has a democratic element that people actually need to take up and work through and basically embrace and define for themselves in this time. And I think since then, and like we've just been talking about intercivilizational unity, this idea of a civilization state, the fact of diversity of civilizations, and this idea of like an age of humanity as opposed to the age of Europe, which is like a single civilization. And it has been taken up, I think, by world leaders like Putin, like Xi Jinping, and now also Trump in his national security strategy. And so I think it's not a concept that you could ignore anymore if you're serious about understanding the world. But when we talk about civilization, we're not just talking about an international relations or a geopolitics, like geostrategic concept. We really are focused on it being a Du Boisian category that's tied to history and humanity. It's not just the relationships between states, but I think a concept that also explains the inner dynamics of societies. And in that same vein, civilization is not a category that should just be left to the academics or the elites or the geostrategics to say this is civilization. And I think for those people, the way that civilization is used or invoked is a pretty conservative statement that's meant to describe the past. And I think it's conservative in that basically it's like circling the wagons and saying, this is what we need to protect, this is what we need to defend, this is what we need to return to say like, this is what is civilized, and anything outside of that, like we need to rally against. And I think for us, civilization is much more than that. It's a concept that is for the people, that is a progressive concept that actually basically expands our sense of what is possible. It's a creative idea of basically humanity dreaming and actually reaching towards something that is new. And I think what the security strategy shows, whether it's able to admit it or not, is that Western civilization, not just Europe, is in existential crisis. When Trump says Europe is facing civilizational erasure, it's really Western civilization is just in existential crisis. And in that, you can see that there's an ideological struggle to even define what Western civilization is or what Western civilization has been. Like, is Western civilization founded on Christianity? Is it based on white people or just the accomplishments of white people? Is it focused on this idea of liberal democracy or a liberal state or like welfare or individual freedom? All of that, I think, is being fought over right now. And I think for us as free school, we have views and opinions of Western civilization, but I think our work that we're really grounded in and focused on is to define American civilization, not even Western civilization, but American civilization. And I think one of our questions is, what is the link between Europe or Western civilization and America? Is our relationship to Europe just our origin story of like white people came and settled, and we inherited, I don't know, we read the Magna Carta, we seceded from King George? Is it about racial mixture? Is it about our origins being white? Is it about values or a theory of the state or a theory of governance? And all of that, I think, is actually up for discussion. And so, yeah, in that light, I think the primary sort of news obsession is this idea of Europe being internally threatened by blood mixture than by the war with Russia. And I think that's what basically the American elites want to frame the security strategy document as being, where they're really obsessed with the idea of Trump saying that within a few decades, certain NATO countries will be majority non-European. And the thing is, like, JD Vance already basically said this earlier in the year, and the fact that they're still not over it and still, I think, want to keep it at that level, and also to say that Trump is obsessed with supporting the far-right nationalists and that they need to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory, I think shows that they would rather keep civilization sort of focused on that level of civilization just being like blood or civilization just being race. And I think in that, when I read the security strategy too, I do think that Trump's framing of civilization is largely defensive and actually like pretty reactionary. And I say that because in the same way that in Black Reconstruction, Du Bois says that in Black Reconstruction, when African Americans actually held the state, built the schools, built the bridges and the infrastructure, that was like, to the white people, that was a degradation of civilization. And that was the ideological argument that was made, that when basically darker humanity or non-white people hold state power or are actually participating in the state, that degrades civilization. And I think there's this idea that, yeah, civilization is overthrown when it's not white. And I think that's some of the paranoia that is said when, like, if civilizational erasure is just tied to basically like migration, that's why. But I think that that's not really true, because I think the way that we would see the crisis of Europe, or why Europe or even America faces a civilizational and existential crisis, it's not because of the presence of non-white people, it's because of a white supremacist system that has prioritized war, that has enabled poverty, and is racist. Yeah, and I think and then there is this one Baldwin quote that I had in the article that I think is still pretty worthwhile, where Baldwin is basically questioning, yeah, what is the relationship of America to the West and to Europe? And how does color play into all of that? And he said, America of all the Western nations has been best placed to prove the uselessness and the obsolescence of the concept of color. But it has not dared to accept this opportunity, or even to conceive of it as an opportunity. White Americans have thought of it as their shame, and have envied those more civilized and elegant European nations that were untroubled by the presence of Black men on their shores. This is because white Americans have supposed Europe and civilization to be synonyms, which they are not, and have been distrustful of other standards and other sources of vitality, especially those produced in America itself, and have attempted to behave in all matters as though what was East for Europe was also East for them. What it comes to is that if we, who can scarcely be considered a white nation, persist in thinking of ourselves as one, we condemn ourselves with the truly white nations to sterility and decay. Whereas if we could accept ourselves as we are, we might bring new life to the Western achievements and transform them. Yeah, and I really like that quote and that framing, because basically what we would say in free school and what we do say is that if America has any civilization at all, it is Black. Like, it is the achievements and the accomplishments of Black people and the Black proletariat that has given America the only sense of civilization that it could possibly have. And the question is whether we can recognize it and actually build upon that. And I think that's obviously what the national security strategy just completely misses, has no concept of. And that's fine, like, it is what it is. I think we've known that there's a lot of whiteness in the Trump admin and how it conceives of the world. But I think there's still, basically in that incoherence or in the sort of confusion of the document, I think there is a lot that is still sort of meaningful, though, where because the national security strategy does accept a multipolar world, or does accept the possibility of basically non-white powers competing or being as good as the Americans are, I think that is really significant. And it's sad that it's significant because it's just accepting the basic reality of the world. But I think it is more open to accepting and working with different countries on the basis of economic cooperation. And I don't think it's excessively ideological or dogmatic about American superiority because of its like liberal democratic values. Instead, it just needs to double down that America is very competent and dynamic and has the greatest economy in the world, which is its own kind of thing. But I think it's good that those are more tethered to like so-called American values, as opposed to, yeah, this political framework that then justifies regime change and interventionist war. And I think even in moving back towards the Northern Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, sorry. Western Hemisphere. I think it sees Latin America as significant, and I think that that's important. But I think, again, it's trying to fight uphill against this, what China and Russia and Asia have already built up, which is that the majority of shipping in the world goes through China. Like, all the ports are in China. And the fact that like these current land strikes and boat attacks like lead to the possibility of war, even in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere. And that puts the administration in a tricky like situation where we see that MAGA is basically already fighting and like kind of falling apart over this question of war, over Israel. And if these wars that are so far away from American soil are so unpopular, how popular could a war that is so close to American land like possibly be? Yeah. And okay. And so I think for our view of civilization, part of my like big motivation writing it 2 years ago was to try to go on the offensive against this white supremacist idea of civilization, of like Western civilization being the reference point for all of civilization, for civilization basically being either like an ancient warring concept, or rather, and not that, but rather a modern one that isn't just defending this like white past, but is actually questioning what the future can hold. If the point of civilization or the point of anything is human progress, and to ask like, what does civilization actually mean for the American people? Like, what shared purpose and what shared democratic demand can we have? And if we call for civilization, what does that actually require of people to like think of themselves, of their place in the world, of their fundamental ideals? And I think that goes to a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about more recently, where whether it's the abolishment of the triple evils of racism, poverty, and war, or this idea of America needing a reconstruction. And I think I like this idea of, yeah, either reconstituting civilization in America or moving towards a third reconstruction, much more than I think just this idea of we need a new industrial policy, or like we need to revitalize like our shared values and commitments. Because in order to build schools, to rebuild institutions, and to create infrastructure, none of that is possible in a framework of white supremacy. And it's clear that the Black workers' sense of civilization is one that is not of conquest or domination or the accumulation of wealth, but it's one that is grounded in real democracy. And so if the United States and Western civilization is in a civilizational crisis, which it is, it's not because of blood mixture or the presence of different races. It's because of war. It's because of imperialism. It is because of the degradation of colored labor. And in my article, I wanted to emphasize this need for moral progress, where civilization is going to be fundamentally crippled by the impoverishment of the worker. And that's because war destroys everything that has been built. It's because racism suppresses the capacity of the people, and it's because poverty suppresses the capacity of the people. And in that sense, civilization has to be linked to peace. And I think for all of the discussion that has been made, and however weak the connection is, I feel like Trump's national security strategy is like somehow it has identified two concepts which are very important, which is civilization and its peace. It's not able to really do too much with the linking of those concepts, but it has identified those two as being the most important. And I think that that's important because, for instance, the New York Times right now is just beating the drums of war. They have this whole series on like, this is the future of war, where they're doing really shiny data visualization and they're putting all of their eggs into this basket. And it has like this eagle that's metal. But they want to talk about, the fact that America's industry is not where it needs to be if it wants to wage war. It's writing articles on the future of war with like AI and Palantir and Anduril and even synthetic biology. And it's even saying that the US needs to stop fighting its universities and attacking the universities because we need the universities to be prepared for war, basically. And so I think in the context of all of that, like it's really important, I think, to still link this idea of civilization and peace together in a time when, the New York Times is really obsessed with trying to basically reinscribe or reassert that the United States' main priority should be war. And I think it's important that even despite all of the other weaknesses of the national security strategy, it is really deep that for the first time, like America is not as obsessed with just explicitly saying like, we need to attack Russia, we need to attack China. Okay, and then lastly, like civilization is, in my mind, it is tied to two things. It's tied to ideas and an imaginary, whether it's religion, whether it's the ideals and aspirations, and it's also tied to the worker. So the concrete world of work, of industry, of social building, what civilization produces, and the actual state and the lives of the worker. And the National Security Memorandum basically discusses both of them. It wants to discuss industry a lot, and it has these assumptions that reindustrializing America will be very straightforward, and that it will be based on technology, whether that's gas and energy and AI, or and that it can be rebuilt on this idea of like wholesome American values of hard work and competence and families and stuff like that. Like, and so I think that is also relevant. What?
No, the 1956.
Yeah, like it's very, it is very like white American, like, oh, we can just buckle down and work hard and we'll be the greatest nation in the world. But to go back to this idea of civilization as tied to like ideas and the imaginary, and then also like the worker, I think that we're in a position where we are trying to work these things out through a sociology study. When we're studying Black gods, which is actually like, what are the ideals and aspirations and the religion that grounds the Black proletariat, who is like the anchor of civilization in this country? And then what is the state of the worker, like through our study of deindustrialization, of what did work do? How did Black people in actually entering these industries, how did they change what work meant? How did they change what these industries actually were in America? And yeah, I think what we're trying to do right now is to explore what the quality of civilization is and must be, I think in increasingly specific and clear terms in this country. whether it's the development of like morality, philosophy, culture, and yeah, like the civilization that the security strategy is bringing up is like very flimsy and I think immature in that regard. But the work to actually define what the alternative is, I think, is something that we have to take seriously. And like, not just us, but like the American people as a whole, like, I don't think we can just be satisfied with this. But the strategy shows that I think the world of the neoconservatives, the world of like Biden and Jake Sullivan and Henry Kissinger, like that world is dead. Like it's over. The West and the civilization is in crisis. And I don't think that these white thinkers have the ideological substance to actually see it through. So, yeah.
What about Thomas Friedman's article?
Which one?
The one where he says that Trump wants civilization war.
Oh, okay, let me find it. That one was really interesting. Hold on, let me find that one. Well, what do you think? Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, what do you think about it?
Well, let's come back to it. I'll come back to it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Well, what Nuri was saying about the partnering of the NS National Security Strategy report, which is a routine report, but this one is in some ways was a really helpful reflection of not necessarily a clear, cohesive strategy on behalf of the Trump administration, but actually shows how deep the crisis is in this country, and how, like Mary was saying, the Trump administration, let alone, I mean, you extend it, I think the broad swath of the ruling elites, the intellectuals, the think tanks, the thinkers, will have an extremely hard time getting out of the crisis. But the articles, like Nuri was saying, the sheer amount of commentary on the report in some ways says more, is really the harbinger. I've been waiting my whole life to say that word. It's really the harbinger of like what's to come. Harbinger of what's to come. And yeah, I actually paid more attention to the Friedman article because I think I read the wrong Financial Times article.
There were so many.
I read the one by the Indian.
Yeah, Janana.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. I read that one, but
You sent it to me.
the Financial Times.
That one was fun.
Clash within civilization.
Oh,
Yeah, there's just, I mean, the sheer amount of commentary, including the mainstream, the attachment onto this concept of civilizational erasure, I think is also says something about the place, the frenzy with which people know that the crisis is much deeper than, let's just say, an economic crisis or a like social crisis. It's a, like we in free school say, it's many layers of crisis piled on each other. And but I paid attention to Friedman's article because I actually tend to not like Thomas Friedman at all. I don't find him very smart, but I found this article I actually found it kind of deep because especially before he even gets to the concept of a third civil war, he identifies there being a potential third civil war, and he says the first was the actual 1860s civil war between the Union and the Confederacy. The second being a civil war, like the civil rights movement, a war over civil rights, a war over, I mean, he goes in much deeper than just civil liberties or civil rights. And he says there's a potential for a third civil war based on civilization itself. I mean, even that, him talking about that concept, him even seeing there as being two existing civil wars before, reminded me a lot of how in free school we talk about there being 3 American revolutions, like distinct periods of the American people confronting like some of the deepest, most existential questions of the state and society and democracy itself in the country. So I found that interesting, but also Friedman essentially says that, and he says a lot, but these are the things that I took out of it, which is he talks about how he identifies, the reason why he identifies the potential for we're in the midst of a third civil war, or that Trump wants there to be another civil war, is that
Which he calls a civilization war.
Yes.
A domestic civilization war.
Right. Oh, it's okay. Domestic civilization war. He raised this question of the American people basically debating over the concept of how would you define home? Like, what is home? I mean, another way of saying it is, what is America? Who is an American? And it's not just identity as an identity politics, but in some ways it is, we would say it's a civilizational question. And I was reminded of when Raju and Ananta were visiting over the summer this year, we had this free school because we were talking about Trump's attack on Iran. We were bringing up the questions of, for example, is every state in this time actually a civilizational state? Every war is a civilizational war. And I remember Nandita saying, in some ways, if we talk about the state, in America, what we see is a state that does not fit the people anymore. A state, because, I mean, it made me think of that because in some ways, the connection, like Mary was bringing up, the National Security Strategy report talks a lot about sentimentality towards Europe. The problem with the report is it's confused. They're not very politically clear. Like, sentimentality towards Europe is different than literally saying that the liberal bourgeois state in the US, the liberal democratic state in the US, does come from ideological and political and historical legacy of Europe. It is objectively a European concept from the Enlightenment, which we in Free School talk about 1776. But that is a tradition that's significant to acknowledge as a revolutionary moment in human history. That concept of a government for the people, by the people, what form would it take in the state, in the processes? And so like literally in the US, there's a state constituted by the Constitution, by certain historical American revolutionary struggle, which Ken Burns, of which I have not watched yet, says like it's also based upon earlier struggles of different peoples, the Native Americans, the French, the British. Like it was an actual contest of arms, contest of human beings, contest of ideas on this continent that then constitutes eventually what we call the American Republic, which is based upon a constitution, a set of ideas, upon like an actual constituting of the state with certain laws and governance procedures, which like I personally don't think I took seriously enough. I'm not sure who really even believes in it anymore, the legitimacy of it. But Nandita was making the point that we have a state, a very specific state that it has to be raised, have the people outgrown this state. I think I raised it, and I don't think I really knew what I was saying back then, to be honest, but I think I know now more, which is there's also the question of, has an assumption of a civilization beneath that state, has the American people outgrown that? Because every state, I actually do think perhaps every state is not just based upon law, it is based upon a certain set of ideals of human beings. It is not just because like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and all these people, all the thinkers, Ben Franklin, it is not because they were just like, oh yeah, it's democracy, dummy, but because they really believed in certain human ideals of democracy, demos. Like there are certain ideals which one could call, even to a certain extent, civilizational, that do underpin states in this time. And I think in America, the question is, what ideals underpin the state today? Has changed over time. It has been consolidated through things like what we call the creation of white supremacy, the Civil War. Like there is, in some ways, if we say history of consciousness, there's also a history of civilization in this country that maybe we haven't totally illuminated. Like, was the fight over the Civil War, was the Civil War like not just about the abolition of slavery, but there was also like through Jim Crow and what Du Bois calls the counter-revolution towards Jim Crow from after emancipation, also was there a change in the understanding of the civilization that underpins the state, and, stuff like that. Like, I could bring that up a lot, but so in some ways, what's being raised, I felt like what Friedman was also raising when he's like, the American people are more and more asking deeper, troubling questions of what is home. I thought it was kind of valid when he said, for example, I do think it's true that whether you call it the Trump camp or certain forms of elites coming out of this constellation of Trump, believe that their leading hand is to consolidate home or to consolidate their sense of home around European Judeo-Christian civilization. And I mean, whatever, I wouldn't even get into the question that I think Derek was also raising, which is what is Western civilization? Historically speaking, what is Western civilization? When did it appear? Because one could argue there wasn't Western civilization until somewhere in the modern 20th century, maybe 19th century. That's a Doc question. Doc can hop in. But so anyway, so that's what I just wanted to raise, and I think I'm just going to underline some of the stuff Nuri said of ultimately there is what this is all showing us that first, like what this is all showing us is that there is a much deeper crisis than just an economic crisis, a security crisis, a military crisis. It is a civilizational crisis that also has a lot of revolutionary potential. And like even in the national security strategy report, even when they're talking about economic competition with China, it's not really about the economy. It's much their lens themselves. It's not really just about the economy. It's an existential question. But yeah, the last thing I just want to raise, and then I know Doc has things to say, is I do think when Nuri was talking, you were so right that it immediately what it brought up, even reading Friedman's article, and he raises very nice questions. I think sometimes to ask the right questions is just as difficult as providing answers. To ask the right political questions in a moment of time is, I was thinking about how Baldwin's like, at the end of Baldwin's life, at the end of even King's life, they were both, I think, raising questions of like Baldwin with Notes on the House of Bondage, or with King and the concept of world house. How does one envision or conceive of the moment in which America's in, where there is a state, there is a government, like there is actually a real like state, right? Like there was a state created by the American Revolution. It has been consolidated over time through different ways, through different struggles, through different revolutions, or what Friedman calls civil wars. But what is yet not satisfied? And how can one identify that there is a state, or even, I think sometimes Baldwin calls it a society, that does not fit the American people in becoming? So how would one resolve that tension between what already exists versus what is not satisfactory for how the American people are moving according to like the logic of American development, which we have been talking a lot about, that there is a logic of American development, but it's almost like the American people have not identified that their maturity is going beyond what currently exists as like a liberal form of democracy, an understanding of Western civilization as our civilization, as our inheritance. And I think that's why King, for example, when he talks about world house, or when he talks about a world house, he's basically saying that, like, at least my interpretation, what I feel like where free school's heading is that, could it be that actually, for example, through the Black freedom movement or the Black tradition, which is every American's tradition, could be every American's tradition, as our understanding of what makes life worth living, what kind of society based on prioritizing who actually unleashes the most democratic potential and that exists in the human being, like all those philosophical questions. King in some ways is basically raising that in order for the American people to have a future as a modern, maturing nation of human beings, Baldwin would say we have to achieve our nation. King would say we have a house that is not yet a home. If that makes sense. We have a house that could become a home if it abandons what we understand as white or Western civilization and already takes the latent potential from the Black struggle, Afro-Asiatic philosophy that already the American people are picking up through the nonviolent struggle. And if they dispense it or inject what already is kind of the bones of a house and make it into like a home. So anyways, that's kind of how I was interpreting the Friedman article and King. So I guess I'll add that to Nuri's introductory presentation.
Do you want to go?
No, you go.
Okay, cool.
Sure.
I see. Well, I wanted to even start by saying this is the first time I actually read the full 33-page document. And having read all of the analysis and commentary and opinion pieces before it, I would have expected that civilization or the category of civilization was much more central to the national strategy, security strategy than it actually ended up being from reading it. And in fact, I feel like I just focused on one thing that the document identifies as, top priority for American strategy is the primacy of nation states, And it was not surprising to me, but basically that also confused me about why the civilizational aspect or the civilizational analysis of Europe was what everybody latched onto.
But could I say this? It's not just civilizational erasure, which means there's something, as Emily said, they were raising an existential crisis for Europe, but as Nuri said, for the West. I just want to say erasure.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is the way Trump, or I have to say Trump because it sounds like sort of an autobiographical sort of document, but I feel like civilization or the idea of Western civilization or white civilization is so ill-defined, or like there was just like from that document, you can't really understand what it even means when it says civilizational self-confidence of Europe and so on and so forth, that I felt like it was almost being used as a placeholder for some other deep-seated anxiety of like a fall in the status of America, but also Europe and so on and so forth. And I feel like that's also how I make sense of why this is what everybody had like such a visceral response to. And especially on the question of immigration or Trump attacking immigration or the sort of changed composition of all these European countries from being mostly white to having a lot of immigrants and less white people. I feel like it also reflects an anxiety of white society, which comes from their identification that they do not produce, they do not or cannot compete with dark humanity in what it is creating at this point of time. But that's sort of just something that, it can be completely wrong, but that's sort of what I was thinking, because a lot of the even in talking about China and then talking about Russia, as Nuri also pointed out, there wasn't like this angle of authoritarianism or human rights and so on, which you're so used to. It was basically everything that Nuri said. It was to see how the West or America can compete with. So it's basically an acknowledgement that we are not the only ones at the top of our game right now. And then I feel like the reason why I was even thinking about the nation state or the emphasis on that is I feel like it becomes very confused. And I think Trump, everything he has been saying about civilization has been very confusing for me, because on one hand, he seems to want to defend Western civilization, but then it is him who attacked those universities. It is him who is talking about non-interventionism in foreign policy. It is him who is talking about we don't want to fight wars which are not in American interest. So it's very confused. I don't understand what he's actually aiming for. And even when he says the nation state has to be protected, I think that's a particularly difficult question for America because of its history, because what is the American nation? And like, can you even like without acknowledging the special place, the existence, the struggles, but also the unique suffering of Black people in this country. What does America as a nation state, on the basis of which the state is consolidated, even mean? And this is what I was thinking of when, Emily, you were saying that it makes sense that every state has an underlying set of ideals, which I think makes most sense, that they are civilizational ideals that defines the state. I think that's the part where I'm completely confused about what Trump or this particular, what do they even mean by civilization, right? And to contrast that with something that I found was very strong in Nouri's article is, I mean, this is not the only point the article is making, but there's it's a very important connection made between civilization and the worker, and especially the Black worker. And I think that it made a lot of sense to me, because civilization is difficult to define. You can use the past, you can use culture, you can use a lot of things to understand what it is. But in general, civilization to me, I think it has to be associated with human beings creating, making something new where nothing else existed, right? And I think that's why civilization being connected to the worker makes so much sense. And I think this is why the question of civilization in white society is so ambiguous, because it stopped producing. It doesn't produce anything anymore. Even in the realm of ideas, there's like narratives that sort of shift around existing ideas, but nothing new, nothing groundbreaking, no new science, no new theory is coming out of the white world, And that's why even in our discussions of assessing like the Marxist framework, whether it can still continue to serve this moment, I think that's also related to that, is what new things are being produced by white society. And if producing and creating and work and all of this is so inherent to our conception of civilization, what is white civilization right now? Right? And what was the other thing? And I think the other thing that Nouri's article I thought was very clarifying was how, in one place, I think you also talk about the different ways in which civilization can be a unifying force. And one of it you point out is that all human beings are civilizationally connected because Africa is where all of humanity starts. But then the more important thing which you emphasize is that civilization has to almost be rethought in the context of modernity, because rethought or renewed in the context of the modern world, which is basically now you can't think of every nation or every people as their separate thing producing their separate civilization. But because of like the Industrial Revolution, because of the slave trade, because of colonialism, the whole world is basically thrown into one big arena, and civilization has to be rethought and reimagined in the context of that modern world. And I think it's just interesting to even try and make sense of all of what the national security strategy says with that basic understanding. Like, I'm not sure it has that basic understanding, even when it's talking about civilizational erasure and so on. Because, I mean, it is an open question. Okay, you kick out, like, all of the immigrants from Europe. What remains? Like, what will Europe do with that? Does it actually have, like Robeson said, having found the key, does it have the vitality to turn it into law? And yeah, I mean, I think I've now lost the train of my thought, but I'll stop there.
Because even on the question of immigration in Europe or America, it's kind of, it's almost a double bind for the ruling elite, because on the one hand, there has to be an argument that, look, our civilization is the best because everybody wants to come here. All these darker people want to come to Europe, want to come to America. And this is a basis for the claim of civilizational supremacy over the rest of the world. People will be like, look, no one's immigrating to China, which is, I mean, not true, but like, those kinds of arguments are important in terms of the self-confidence of what is so-called Western civilization. And then on the other hand, like, I think Trump because I always feel like, yeah, like with Trump, we're not really looking for a coherent thing. We're looking for him kind of reflecting backwards anxieties of the ruling elite that have been maybe suppressed and are coming out, but don't come out in a coherent or logical way necessarily. But because they are like these suppressed anxieties, like it comes out and like always this strange refracted and oftentimes contradictory way. But then it's like the ideology of the ruling elite itself is already contradictory. So it's like it's just a compounding of that. And so I think, yeah, like I remember like a year, maybe, I don't know, over the past couple of months, there's like one of Doc, you had talked about Trump wanting to walk backwards into the future, which is a quote from Du Bois. But it is really true. It's like the only future they can envision is a return to the 18th and 19th century. They can only envision like literally the Monroe Doctrine and like great power imperial conflict of that led to World War I. And like that is their best hand. That is like the best hand that you can give in terms of this is our proposal for the future. Never mind that, like, one, if you're already setting yourself up for great power conflict and rivalry, then you're basically saying, oh, maybe we are doomed to world war perpetually and no one can escape it. So we just need to do like battleground America, fortress America in order to protect ourselves, you know? But I think like it's also missing the basic point, which is that, let's say World War I was, yes, a battle between imperialist powers, but also it was a battle between European powers. It was a battle within Western civilization itself. And I don't know, so like, I think those are important aspects, because it's like, if you compare, like, because it is true that Trump's discourse on civilization is a kind of breakaway from the kind of hitherto prevailing ideology of like the kind of transatlanticist, like neoliberal globalist thing, in which they're not so cavalier at talking about, you know, we're the best civilization, but they say it in other ways. And that is what Joe Biden represents. That is what, like, you know, all these EU leaders who are shitting their pants about Trump, that's what they represent. And what scares them the most is that whether Trump is right or not, they have to come to terms with the fact that history has already passed them by. And they can't come to terms with that. And I know this like very intimately because like in my work, I work with like a lot of Europeans, and they don't know what to do about Trump. Like it's like psychologically they're unable to make sense of it because it fucks so much with like their self-conception. But it's like reflecting back on them in a way that they can't come to terms with, because yeah, like at the bottom of like even Trump saying civilizational erasure, it's like not just about the migrants, but it's about, well, if European civilization is so great, it should be able to absorb lots of different people. And it should have the vitality to like basically assert itself on the world stage in the way that maybe you would want it to, but it doesn't. Europe doesn't have the energy left. Like there's nothing left in Europe. And so it's like, on the one hand, these European leaders they need the foreign migrants because their labor force is shrinking, because like like people aren't having kids and like all that stuff. And so I don't know, that's one thing I want to say. And then I think in terms of the actual like our conception of civilization itself, I do think that like it's not, in some ways, maybe we don't talk about it enough, but people like Robeson, Du Bois, Baldwin, King, they are forerunners of a new concept of civilization. And they were like, because I was even looking back at some of like Robeson's speeches, and as early as like maybe 1940s, even before the Cold War really started, Robeson was experimenting in his speeches with this idea of civilization. And there's a speech that he gave, I think, to like, maybe it was like garment workers somewhere. I forget which city, but he was like, the ruling elite want to say that we own American civilization. And then Robeson was like, no, the people own civilization. The people produce American civilization. We are the real inheritors of the American civilization if it exists. And so I think that really goes along with what you were saying about the essay. But that also like, yeah, he because yeah, actually one of the things that I've always really liked about Robeson was the way that he talked about the Korean War, where he was like, this was a speech that he gave in 1952 after there'd been a kind of ceasefire established after the first year of war, where he said, 100,000 Americans dead, wounded, and missing, and have been listed in this war, which nobody, not even the most cynical politician, bothers to even call a police action anymore. And more than that, we have killed, maimed, and rendered homeless 1 million Koreans, all in the name of preserving Western civilization. US troops have acted like beasts, as do all aggressive, invading imperialist armies. North and south of the 38th parallel, they have looked upon the Korean people with contempt, called them filthy names, raped their women, lorded it over their women and children, and shot prisoners in the back. And so like Robeson was really like sensing, on the one hand, very sensitive to the ideology of the American ruling elite, especially this ascendant period of American empire in after World War II. And on the other hand, it's like, yeah, it's like why, if Western civilization is so great, like why is it that in order to preserve Western civilization, you need to kill all these people? Like it doesn't make any sense, but it only makes sense if like that is essentially like what is the concept of Western civilization itself. And yeah, he has this other speech that he gives maybe in like the 50s, I think, where he's like, yeah, he says, the illusion of an American century blinds the Western ruling elite. It blinds them for the immediate present to the clear fact that civilization has already passed them by, and that we now live in a people century. And yeah, I just really like it because it's like they are, as Emily said, like harbingers of this long-term historical process that we've been trying to understand. And it's like, yeah, like you can say on one hand, like this kind of internal battle within the West over like, oh, is our Western civilization, is it like the kind of globalist thing? Is it the kind of neoliberal thing? Or is it the kind of really self-conscious race thing that Trump embodies? And then on the other hand, you have like Xi Jinping being like, no, we propose a global civilizational initiative, which says that all civilizations have an interest in cooperating with each other, but even more than that, that we are interested in human-to-human, person-to-person contact between the people of different civilizations. And it's like that itself is very indicative of like a world that has already passed the West by. And it's like Trump, in a way, it's like, yeah, like I agree with what Mary was saying. It's no matter what Trump does, and no matter what the counter responses from other parts of the elite, it's like, it's all from a defensive, weak position. They can't make any kind of assertive, like forward-thinking vision because history's already passed them by. And so everything that they do, no matter how hard they try, is a kind of desperate attempt to reclaim something, which I don't even think Trump, when you get down to it, really believes in. Because it's like, if you were so serious about saving Europe, then you would actually be invested in like, okay, like maybe let's do regime change in these European countries to install these like right-wing populist parties, but they're not going to do that. Like maybe they'll back them rhetorically, but it's like, I don't know. I just don't think that like they have any kind of strong hand to play. So yeah.
Thank you, Nuri, for your diagnosis of what is, in fact, I'm calling it an autopsy. The body is laying before them, and now they're trying to do an autopsy, and they're bungling that. A lot of times in free school, I'm smiling and making faces all the time. And when I look back at free school, I'm trying to say, oh, I'm making all these faces. The only person that makes faces as much as me is Kathy. We're all, because it, to me, is so much to smile about, so much to be elated about, and just the sense that we have been on the right path, we've been on the right road all the time, even when very few people wanted to listen to us. I think that that this is not so much a geostrategic document as an autopsy on a civilization, and the fact that the civilization is connected to whiteness when you get below the surface suggests that the ruling elite are panicking over the crisis of whiteness. And they're panicking over the crisis of whiteness where they understand the crisis better to the extent that they can understand it in the United States, which would suggest, as we have, discussed so often, that more and more white people, if not openly, at least in the deepest recesses of their minds and souls, believe that this white thing has played out. And is there an alternative to it? How this will evolve and manifest, you just don't know. But this is what is happening. The other thing is what they're calling Western civilization is really modernity. It's really not ancient Greece or Rome or even the Islamic world or ancient China, India, all of which is a foundation for modernity. But what they're talking about is modernity. And they're talking about, in one sense, the world that emerges on the foundation, the material foundations of the rise of capitalism, the history of capitalism. And I think Becker's book is more than helpful. And you can see I'm carrying it with me. Just a parenthetical thing, you kind of fall in love with a book that helps you to understand how little you knew. And this book helps me to understand how little I knew, how I was trying to piece together things that he, through his tremendous effort and whoever his research team is, have begun to connect dots in a very sophisticated way. But once you say the history, that the material foundation for Western, what we call Western civilization or modernity, is capitalism, and not just capitalist, but a global system of capitalism, you're immediately talking about working people. And once you go there, and especially in the United States, you must inevitably centralize the Black proletariat. Now, this, you might suggest that this is doing it deductively, from principles down, but I don't think so. Based upon this great research and other stuff, Du Bois, of course, we're doing it inductively. That is to say, the evidence irrefutably shows that capitalism did not rise in Europe. It became located in Europe, which was the most backward destination on this global trading system. That might not make a lot of sense. In other words, if by civilization, a Western civilization, they're meaning modernity, and they're talking about the rise of capitalism, you then have to look at a architecture which is not European. And if you talk about modernity, you're talking about a world, you're talking about a foundation in world humanity and ultimately in world civilizations. So in fact, the workers in the mines of Peru producing silver and they were working under the most brutal conditions, even more so than chattel slavery, which makes Du Bois's evaluation. It was not the worst of all labor systems. There had been labor systems, especially in the mines of Peru, that were even more genocidal. But this new system that ultimately evolves into what we call a white supremacist social system, maybe with capitalist foundations or capitalist economics, but a civilizational system. When we talk about a white supremacist social system, we are really talking about something more than the economic system. And hence, civilizations are a manifestation of the history of consciousness. And if you look at the processes leading to the establishment of capitalism in Europe and then ultimately in the Western Hemisphere, you're talking about a movement of human consciousness on a world scale. So the West is, when they talk about Western civilization, they're talking about modernity and ultimately about a social economic system which is underpinned by a great civilizational movement. That is why when we, once again, I think we're saying now we're going to do it on Christmas Eve, get into the Ken Burns documentary, which is very important again. We will look at it through the lens of civilization and the rise of modernity.
Yeah.
And why was the Western Hemisphere? A lot of people say that, well, Christopher Columbus was trying to find a route to India that would get around the Dutch and others, and they were. I'm not convinced that they were so ignorant they didn't know there was something on the other side of the Atlantic, this great landmass. I think they were trying to do both because they so quickly adapted to this, be it the Caribbean and then the landmass of North and South America. I mean, you know, they weren't that ignorant. There have been at least 500 years before Christopher Columbus of these great trading networks. Merchants and traders and explorers knew all of this. They didn't know everything, but they had a sense. But but my point is, I just want to say, I don't know that any national security strategy document, like you said, Nuri, has gotten this kind of attention. There have been geostrategic analyses. For example, Alex Craner or Ben Norton. Alex Craner will, for example, say that this represents, as you said, Nuri, that the Trump administration, in its ham-handed and really incoherent way, are trying to adapt to a new kind of world where Europe is not, and even the United States cannot be the center of it, the multipolar world. They're trying to say that. They're also trying, and this concept of civilizational erasure, civilization crisis, you know, I agree with you, Nuri. I'm not convinced they know precisely what they're talking about, but they're improvisationally trying to say something about a world that is very different from the world that we have known. You know, the last 80 years since the end of World War II, it is a different world. And the Trump people, or at least that part of the ruling elite, are trying to retool ideologically, I would even say epistemologically, to a world where now you're facing this industrial, I would also add, civilizational behemoth known as China, that is aligned with Russia. And increasingly, and I was saying this to Pur and to Shantu, that it occurs to me that Putin's trip to India and the way it was celebrated by Modi in unusual ways, ways that are not usual for an Indian prime minister to roll out a red carpet and himself to go to the airport and welcome Putin. This was unusual, which was a slap in the face to the Trump administration and saying to them, we have options. But, think about it. If Putin and Xi are so close strategically, and they are, I don't know of many times in history that two nations have been so strategically bound as are China and Russia at this time. Now, if China and Russia are tight like that, and India and Russia are tight like that, well, how could it not be that if India and China are not tight like that, they're tighter than they're giving on at this point? And what does this triangle suggest? The two most populous nations in the world, and one of the minerally richest nations in the world, certainly one of the largest land masses in the world. What does this suggest? And what does it mean when Modi goes to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in China and is a member of BRICS and is part of the Belt and Road Initiative? Let me just say one small other thing. This is why I see this as an autopsy. The de-dollarization. Most of the trade between Russia and China are in renminbi or yuan and rubles. Most of the trade between India and Russia, rupees and rubles. Most of the trade between China and India is the same, rupees and renminbi. Most of the trade, where does it end? Most of the trade between Saudi Arabia and China is in, Emily, the petro yuan or petro renminbi. What is left out of all of these relationships? The US dollar. In many ways, the foundation of US power was not the military as much as it is the dollar. But what is the other dimension of this? It is civilization and culture. We are free, you are not. If you want to be free, you have to emulate us. And thus they carried out color revolutions. A lot of us forget that the color revolutions that failed were in China. Hong Kong, after 1999, and the Uyghurs, after, they tried to have an uprising there, a kind of a Islamic kind of thing. And the Chinese government shut that down, as they say, with the quickness. Or Tiananmen Square, or, and I think it has failed, if you don't mind me just going around, in Taiwan. Taiwan was to be a base of color revolution against China. That was defanged. And I think to understand it properly what China is doing, even what China is doing in the South China Sea. These are moves not economic or military strategic as much as it is a statement of civilization and civilizational reach. And I'll just say, this, I'm talking too fucking, forgive me. I mean, Taiwan, first of all. The Taiwanese people are divided 50-50 between separating as a separate nation state from China and those who are saying that the path forward for Taiwan is to reunite with China. To me, it's a no-brainer. What future does Taiwan have outside of being with China and in China? There is no future for the Taiwanese people. And Kathy, I'm always reminded in discussing this with your trips to China and Taiwan and how you saw Taiwan as separating civilizationally from China. I just have to say, I think you may have overreacted.
Probably did.
No. But what was occurring is two competing tendencies civilizationally.
I'd say 50-50. Better way to put it.
Even your observations about China, were you trying to understand, Chinese young people wearing more traditional dress, going to museums, seeing if the modernization of China means the decline of Chinese civilization and is Western civilization through commodities and the internet, whatever, is Chinese civilization being compromised in the rush to modernize China? Huge question. We don't yet know the answer to that question. However, because this is so multi-leveled and interconnected and is not one thing this document recognizes: a civilizational confidence in the leadership of China. I would also say in the leadership of India, a renewed confidence. On the other side, a civilizational pessimism in the West. I'll just end up. And Nuri, I am so grateful to you for your reading of Baldwin into this. It is an unusual reading of the problem. Really it is. And I just hope there are more ways to publish your work. But, Baldwin's diagnosis, it is at the point that you identify yourselves as white. That will be your greatest crisis. That's what Baldwin was saying. Your greatest crisis is not your economy, it will be your civilizational identification with whiteness. And that, to liberate this country, it has to liberate itself from whiteness and become, as Baldwin said, the last white nation. This is huge. And so I just have one last point I want to make, because this document makes sense when the ruling elite and the Trump people, especially Trump, with all of the bombast and foolishness, he is prepared to say what other presidents would not say. And I give him credit for that. I think that's why we had a, kind of leaning towards him in 2024. he would speak truths that other presidents would not speak. This thing on civilization, he is speaking a truth. He is literally, when he says Europe, obviously he's talking about America in a certain way. Not in a Baldwinian sense, not in a Du Bois, not in a Paul Robesonian sense, not in a free school sense. The erasure. What is the erasure of Europeans? The erasure of whiteness. What is he saying? That's stupidly put. You know, that all of these immigrants who are praying differently, who have different civilizational histories and different histories of consciousness, are coming into Europe. And he is saying the European political elite have no answer to this because there is no answer to it. We don't have birth rates that will allow us, you know, to take care of the older generation and pay taxes and so on. We need younger people. Frankly, we need the brain power that people from Asia and the Middle East and Africa bring.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So the only answer is not the erasure of civilization, the erasure of whiteness. Now, there's a gospel song, "Oh Happy Day," and I don't want to take a victory lap too soon, but it is a very happy moment that Europe has recognized that whiteness is a dead end, and ultimately, the American people will. My last. Nuri, I think another contribution that you made, and I think it's Baldwin, it's Paul Robeson, it's to anchor civilization to working people. And in the United States, it is so obvious to us that the anchorage of the next civilization is the Black proletariat. You cannot get around it. And all this other talk and settler colonialism and all this, where are you going with that? All that talk. You can't, you may as well get on the side with Trump in there. Because you done gave up. There is a future. There is a future. And I think it is more than Gramsci's interregnum. And even, I keep thinking about this. Are we on the cusp of a pre-revolutionary moment? Are we on the cusp of civil war? Which is what Friedman says. Which I think we have to look, I think we should dissect a little more. Get below, you got to get below these cats because they don't say everything. They don't even know all that they're thinking sometimes. Because it's panicky, it's improvisational. It's like a cat having a nervous breakdown. You know what I'm saying? You're going to, get on crack at least, or do something for yourself, ecstasy, because it don't look good. Because it's like a nervous break. I'm sorry to get good. A nervous breakdown. And what is it over? The erasure of whiteness. It don't work. And when Nundatha made that point, which is brilliant, that the U.S. state or Western civilization does not fit America. Just my last point. The music symposium, when we highlighted essentially three composers, Ellington, Mingus, and Sun Ra. This is civilizationally very significant. We literally said that American civilization is not what the elites say it is. Serafina sent me Leonard Bernstein playing and talking about Debussy, the French composer. I was hoping she was here today. I wanted to say that Debussy is a less rich expression of Duke Ellington. The whole Impressionist school within French music, and I would even suggest in some ways in the Russian musical school, is very rooted in their experience with African American music. So I agree. I think we have to do more because we're talking about a new epoch being born. And in a lot of ways, and I think Trump understands this, and I hate to admit he understands everything because I don't like what he's doing down there in Venice. Leave them people alone. Leave that alone, man. You don't need to be all up in there. You know, now he has really cut Bibi Netanyahu and Israel loose. He done cut them loose. I don't even think they came up in the document, did they?
Not really, no.
They're like a heavy weight, you know, not just for the American people, but for Europe.
Well, because I think he just wanted to say that he's facilitated 8 different peace plans
Yeah.
between like Pakistan and India. So it's like all past tense. where
Yeah,
it's like,
I don't think he mentions Israel at all.
But there's an open question which Friedman raises of
Yes.
if it's a quote unquote civilization war that the Trump administration wants to fight, the comparison that Friedman draws is to Israel. And because that is much more explicitly a civilization war.
Very interesting in the Samuel Huntington sense.
Yeah, and there's been some interesting articles about the different ideological factions within MAGA.
Go ahead.
And some of them are the like really hardcore, like definitely drawing from, I think there's even like, I think like Ezra Pine has interviewed some of them, like people from Israel who've kind of ingratiated themselves with like the MAGA, like intellectual world and are trying to make a case for quote unquote American nationalism, which draws from the Israeli model. So there are like ideological elements that have tried to, I don't know, whether it's infiltrate or just make influential inroads into the MAGA movement, but they're only one kind of cadre, I guess, within the larger like contested terrain, which is what is the future of the MAGA movement? Does it even have a future?
But what is the see?
Yeah.
Here's the contradiction. You take like Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens and what's his name, Tucker. You know, the most vociferous anti-Zionist. You know, but they're trapped in a contradiction.
Yeah.
Just go ahead.
Because there was Tucker did an interview with Francesca Albanese, who is the UN rapporteur on Palestine.
Oh, yes.
Who has been very vocal. I think she released this report about like the economy of genocide and how it's not just the military contractors, but all of these American and Western companies that are invested in Israel, the tech companies and all that. And what was really funny about it, in a sad way, was like Tucker was like, he's so perplexed. He can't make sense of it because he's like, he's like, we the West, we the Americans with Israel, when we do collective punishment, when we kill innocent women and children, he's like, we've ceased to become Western civilization. He's like, what defines Western civilization is our morality. But then when you come face to face with the actual real reality of the West as it has been received by the rest of the world, then it's like like you said, the worldview crumbles. They have no, it's like, no, like it can't be, this can't be like who we are. And I don't know, I found that very striking because he's like, this is not Western civilization. But then the answer from like darker humanity, from Black people is like, yes, this is Western civilization.
But see, this isn't this an interesting thing, and this is the problem of whiteness, as identified by Baldwin. I mean, I think I guess we're gonna have to do another year involved with, you know what I'm saying? Because, this is Baldwin, this schizophrenia. Whiteness is a trap. A wage for whiteness has evaporated. Even the psychological benefits of whiteness no longer serve white people. You know, this is why the white masses, even though, you know, the Tuckers and those will talk about white family values and we want to keep it white and we white people have done all of this shit. Well, stop listening to Aretha Franklin. You know, if you're so white, keep it white. You know, Dolly Parton, you know, your white country and Western music. Don't listen to R&B. I mean, if you're gonna keep it pure and white, do that. But you can't do that. Because if you eliminate the black proletariat, you ain't got nothing. And so I'll end. I know, let me stop talking North Philly. But I think, Nuri, the question of the document is how do we get out of this crisis when we're dealing with forces on a world scale? Because that's what this does. But then when they look home, then they're dealing with a whole nother set of crises. And there is no way out of it except what we would call a revolutionary democratic path. And it is. And I think we can talk more about the mechanisms of the realization of this. How does that become real? And what are the ideological conditions? I would even say the epistemological conditions for this. And I guess I'm like, I feel a sense of possibility, a real, at this time. And it's not just because I sense this in Black folk, but increasing numbers of white people who don't vote and reject everything but that culture that comes from the Black proletariat.
I just wanted to make a small comment is everything that has been said is also reminding me of what we've been saying in the past about how the defeat of Reconstruction becomes this very important moment in American history. Because I think the way, like what I was saying, I was confused by in the National Security Strategy document was basically how the word or the category of civilization was being used. And what you said about what Trump really means when he's talking about civilizational erasure in Europe is the erasure of whiteness. That makes a lot of sense.
That's because if you see the way they use it, it is just that.
But then I think the question, like the reason why I was thinking about Reconstruction again was it wasn't forever that Western civilization was synonymous to whiteness. And then like at some point that break or that divergence did happen. And I feel like the defeat of Reconstruction maybe most closely approximates that shift.
I think I would agree. If I could just say one thing, I think you're absolutely right. A different chronology than 1776 to the present. You have to see the revolutionary possibility of the defeat of the victory of the Civil War, and then Reconstruction and its defeat. The logic, the historic logic of the democratic struggle in the United States would have been vastly different. And as you say, I agree with this, there would have been no need for this deep and unbelievable investment in whiteness as a civilizational foundation of American society. The defeat of Reconstruction is its origin. And I think that looms That's why, and when you listen to King, you listen to Robeson. Let's not forget, Robeson's father was a slave. Henry Winston comes out of the slave South. King is out of and they're all talking the same way. That I'm sorry. I think that is it, Corb. I think that is it, and thus the American Revolution. The prequel of the American Revolution is Reconstruction. Reconstruction explains the American Revolution. The defeat of Reconstruction explains the American Revolution. And the Civil Rights Movement is a prequel to Reconstruction. In other words, it's not linear, it's almost cyclical. That to understand the American Revolution, you have to understand Reconstruction and its defeat. You understand? To understand Reconstruction, you have to understand the Civil Rights Movement. It is not the linear logic. It is something else, and I don't know how to put it right now, but it is a logic, Michelle, a logic of investigation. To investigate American history, we need to deploy different logics, and we have to work this one out.
Well, I do feel like, well, I don't think I'm ready yet to pick up, but highly ready to put this into words, but I am sensing how we're trying to apply a new form of logic to understanding like white or Western civilization, but also work out a new logic for an alternative. That's as far as I can kind of go, but I feel like what we're starting to say here, I mean, I'm really grateful for this discussion because I just found the flood of like commentary again on the national security strategy document just so convoluted because the document itself is so inconsistent, but at the same time full of contradictions, but so important to helping us understand what it is that, you know, Free Schools dedicated ourselves to working out in terms of this crisis and has been for like, yeah, the past 5, 10, maybe even 15 years. But it reminds me of how, yeah, like there was once a time in Free School, was it Wanda that said like, we are either heading towards civil war or world war? And then
Yes,
now we're starting to sort of see how even that framework is brought up in the Friedman thing of like civilizational war also reflects something not just about like over there in Europe, but like it actually has something to do with home. Those two things of like a world or global kind of dimension to like the Civil War, like more connected. Even so, like you're not going to pick that up exactly from like the Thomas Friedmans. You're going to have a better sense of what this all means if you're able to, you know, like
So that we got a sense of what all this all means.
It's like they're not like you're not going to pick that up from the Friedman article.
No.
You have to, as you're saying, get beneath it. And like in some ways, it's so interesting that, you know, in Free School, like I feel like it sounds like Friedman's also really interested. Like he uses the framework of there being 1, 2, and 3 civil wars, but he never uses the framework of the first Reconstruction and then the second Reconstruction during Civil War.
But it's interesting that he too sees 3.
Yeah,
I found that
but he sees it in terms of war and not Reconstruction. He sees it as like clashes and like all this expressions of like anxieties and tensions and two sides. He doesn't see it as like, oh, we reconstruct, we rebuild, like kind of in this vein that I feel like I'm actually really appreciating how we're linking so much of civilization to the Black worker as well, and the fact that there is something about the framing of not just Civil War, but in terms of Reconstruction that's more generative, civilizational even, and even more of an assertion of a building of a new kind of society as an alternative to the white supremacy or even the kind of system or social system with like, you know, as we're talking about. Yeah. I would try to finish that, but the words aren't coming to me. But I think something that I'm starting to also appreciate, also like that Nuri you brought up, that civilization had like the two components of it being the worker
and the other side of it also being the imaginary. I started thinking about this conversation that we're having in the context also, as we're saying about the defeat of Reconstruction. Like just now, we were the kind of back and forth you and Forgo were having about like what happened in the wake of, you know, when there was a brief moment that Reconstruction or whiteness and civilization were not synonymous. And then the reassertion from like white supremacy to say like, no, we're going to still insist that whiteness and civilization are synonymous. It's in this new form, kind of a white supremacist social system. And here we have things like what we're going to come up with: Jim Crow, lynching, sharecropping, and like really make sure that that connection is cemented. There is no way out of that in a time when like slavery is no longer an institution. We're going to continue to push this line. And Black folk had to say like, wait, if you're going to do that, if you're going to so take that line. And I feel like this thing of Black gods is important where one, it's that they're like, well, we don't accept that because we're going to uproot ourselves and we're going to go to the north and try to find something different. We're going to try to like, this betrayal of Reconstruction is so egregious. We're not going to stick around necessarily. We're going to try to build something new in the north. Oh wait, but the north is still not free of all these contradictions of white supremacy, but in this northern urban, you could even say, I guess, because recently the Black Gods group we were reading, we went back to E. Franklin Frazier's and his chapter on the cities of destruction and his account of the Great Migration. And it is also like, he is describing kind of the emergence of a certain kind of northern Black proletariat that came, who just a generation ago, or even just a mere few years ago, were southern Black proletariat. But then the northern Black proletariat and the consciousness of, say, white supremacy in the forms of, say, Chicago's South Side or Harlem or New York's Harlem or even Philadelphia's North Philadelphia necessitates, like, I feel that this question that of civilization, origin stories, even an understanding of what is America, how did America come to be, what is the meaning of these two races, white and Black? Where did that even come from? Who are we as Black people? These are all things that I feel like Black people have never stopped struggling for. And like when you use the word harbingers, I thought about it. It's like King had a response, Robeson had a response, but then also you can just tell that Black people never stopped asking that question in the midst of the defeat of Reconstruction, because that question of like, who are we? What is our origin story? Where did the white man come from? Is he the devil? Did we come from Asia? Did we come from, the original peoples? We know we didn't come from here. We know we didn't come from Europe. Like, our heritage cannot be Europe, clearly. We know we also came from Africa, but is there a logic that frees us up to say that we are a people who came from even the lost tribes of desert, or even from the Asiatic Black man, that in this world explains why we are so stripped of who we are. And this is all the lies that white folk have told us about who we are. Essentially, I feel like this is all I'm just adding, I feel like, another dimension to this question of civilization that I feel like Black folk have never stopped asking. And it makes even this idea that the Nation of Islam said that the white man has 6,000 years and his time is up, even more meaningful in this moment, because it's
how many years?
6,000, right?
Oh yeah, they gave him 6,000.
Yeah, I'm not making all the sense, but I feel like I'm trying to put it together. Or even that Prophet Cherry was also very, it's just so many different responses across Black folk, even in that all came out of the Great Migration, that all came out of the defeat of Reconstruction, that all are civilizational in nature, and are all seeking a way to explain and prepare themselves for a future, basically, where the future is not white. The future is best explained by aligning oneself or seeking lineage with the source of humanity itself in Africa and in Asia, actually more so. Even this idea that Moors being an Asiatic people, or even Black Jews being from, say, West Asia, all of these things.
Can I say one thing? I hate that, the global origins of modern capitalism and the
Sure.
global origins of the proletariat. That is what Elijah Muhammad and them were referencing when they talk about an Asian roots. It's so interesting that when you look at this, I mean, just quickly, when we look at this as a manifestation of a history of consciousness to be free,
Right.
you had to rewrite the narrative of who you were and your origins and the origins of the system. And they're right about this. They are global. But so I'm sorry to interrupt you, Pat.
To add on to that, I feel that the edge of that rewriting of the narrative, more so than even just saying we're an African people, is to say that there is such a thing as like the Africa that we were even enslaved and taken out of was constituted by this, like as Du Bois said in The World in Africa, like a rich interaction with not just Europe, but actually with Asia and the Indian Ocean basin, or even all this exchange in North Africa between like really like Asia and Africa being like two very connected continents. And I feel that also frees, I mean, it is closer to the truth in some ways than say the cultural nationalist argument that is like, it's just Africa and this continent, we within Africa. And that's not unfair to say, because lots of like exchange within the African continent and the different civilizations there are important to study, but that's not the only source of that vitality or that exchange or that dynamism, or even, as you're saying, the economic, but not just economic exchange. It's also constituted by like, the exchange of, between Asia and Africa, which I think in the bones of the people who were enslaved, they knew that like that's true, like and whatnot.
But it's so contemporary. It is so contemporary, which, if I can just say, why is the reception of the free school so radically different with the Nation of Islam as opposed to certain cultural nationalists? Why is it? Why is the Nation of Islam more open to Asia than cultural nationalism?
Well, that if we're gonna look to even like what this means for now, or what the American people's responses or options on the table really are, it is also to say that all of those responses during the feat of Reconstruction, the Great Migration, all of those things are so contemporary because they still speak to this enduring need to be like, we're really sure that like whiteness, like its day is up, like we're really, really over this idea that we really come from Europe. Like, what are we going to get from like, entrenching ourselves by, going to war with Russia, or like trying to defend Ukraine? Like, we're ready for something new. We want to be part of it. We want something that can explain our origins, but also our path forward. And this is like the part of civilization that gets to be futuristic and more generative and more helpful in that sense, in addition to explaining origins or the past or our lineage or our record of who we are. And I think that that's also, I think that's kind of why, and it sounds like in the Black Gods we're very interested in figuring, we're taking our time by like understanding the context of the early part of the 20th century, but it also is slowly like looking towards the sense of where what this shows about the American people capacity to want to rewrite their civilizational narrative, to want to strive towards basically interweaving what all of that those values, those narratives into their lives today, and creating new institutions or even just new pathways, or even looking at themselves as like agents of resistance against white supremacy, and interweaving it so much into like not just their religious institutions, but even the way they raise their children, or the music as you're connecting it to the symposium. It's like ways of like interweaving this framework so much into the way they live that they're ready for they're prepared for basically a new world, or they're prepared and setting themselves up for the world to come. And I think that that's the value of, actually taking all this stuff civilizationally very seriously. And, again, like I really appreciate, Mary, when you said that it's not just something that explains the past, or something that just also like is the property of the elite, that like the people have always wanted to find a civilizational explanation or way out, and especially Black folk who have always found these questions to be not just thorny, but existential and ready to be worked out in new ways that are not just going to trace ourselves back to Europe or to whiteness, but to something that reconnects with like humanity. And it's also, oh, I totally forgot to mention this too, and the way I was kind of trying to read so many points, but it's also the reason why, like, to go back to King, like another civilization response, like, I feel like we bring this up so often, but the pilgrimage to nonviolence, where of course, like he took the time to, you know, walk through the, like, you know, philosophical and theological canon of Western civilization, whether it's through like maybe the Greeks, and like we were studying this in, you know, his early education and whatnot, chronicled in the Taylor Branch book about King's early days, but it's also that he went through to like the modern European philosophies like Hegel and Nietzsche, and then even like to like his contemporaries of like Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Those were like his contemporaries in some ways, because that was World War II, and it was still insufficient. And to see and to see the resolution in India and Gandhi and even nonviolence or all of this, and to say like that is the way to, like, it may not have made, you know, it didn't click maybe right away when he came about, but when the time came, it made all the sense in the world that the nature of the civil rights movement had to take that kind of quality that certainly had to be forged out of like a civilizational, you know, basis in India. And I don't know, this is, I don't have anywhere else to go with it, but it is also, it's to me like what, you know, what we're saying about the Black workers' consciousness and the Black workers' imaginary and the Black like aspirations and gods is starting to, you know, all come together.
Yeah, I'd like to share some of my observations in Germany to further assess the crisis of Western civilization based on Mary's presentation, as well as share some of my observations in India to get a sense of the future, both for the world and for the United States. So yeah, I had a, no, it was brief. Thank God it was brief. Layover in Germany, and one, like, these bums, man, these bums have just become incompetent. Make me board a plane with, like, you know, this huge like 2-story plane, and then they make us get off because they're like, oh yeah, you guys don't have any oxygen in the plane, like we fucked up. And you know, I'm getting off the plane and I'm just like, you know, walking just all throughout the airports, both in Munich and Frankfurt. I'm like, oh my God, look at all these brown people, man. This is a beautiful sight to see. I don't know what the white people are up to, man. I don't think their pockets are doing as well right now. But you have all these brown people that I'm talking to, and they're like, I'm an IT professional. I'm an engineer. And then, you know, they're in good spirits and all that. But then you have like all these white people that are like, I'm not used to this kind of racism, to be honest. They like go out of their way to be rude and disrespectful to you. Not ask lady at the counter, oh, they switched my gate. Is this where this flight is coming out? She like walks outside the counter and she's like, does it say gate 48? Just trying to make me feel dumb. And this like anger and this kind of like resentment and this kind of outward disrespect, I believe was mild to me compared to a lot of the Indians, because I'm more light skinned, right? They can't distinguish between the, you know, the brown people, right? But they treated the other Indians a lot worse. And this is I believe a reflection of that concern with the future of white civilization, both their capacity to produce and reproduce, and like, you know, I'll give an example of these like elite Indians I met in India who lived in Germany and went back to India. You know, these are like, you know, high up there people in Germany. Their daughter in Germany was learning to, like, you know, write letters, and then they moved back to India, in Aurangabad, not a tier 1 city by any means, right? Pretty in the cut kind of city. And all the Indian kids in the school are able to read and write English. This is not an English-speaking country, but in Germany, the German kids are not able to read and write in English yet. And so you have like all of these like very intelligent and like capable brown people that they need to rely upon to operate the country. and to, I would say, sustain themselves, because they have gotten, I think, comfortable with the social welfare and incompetence, and comfortable with themselves as a supposed superior people until now the country is, at least at the highest levels, occupied by all these brown people. And I think it's probably
At
similar.
the highest level.
I think operating, I think it's similar to United States in that, like, for example, I'm working in my job, and I had never talked to a white person in a long time until, it's all Indians, it's all Chinese. And then I start to present to the board, and I'm like, oh my God, this is all white people. This is my first white person on the job. Holy shit. So I think they try to have the country organized so that you could have, like, the German, quote unquote, German citizen be the beneficiary of other people coming in to produce and reproduce. And now they're surprised and anxious at their incompetence to deal with the world. And it was interesting. Like, I even saw it in my own personal interactions, because I was, I was out here getting disrespected, and people were looking at me real dirty. And then I had to take a work call, and I'm talking about AI. And then I see all these people, they have like they're looking at me different now. They don't know how to, they're a little anxious, because on the one hand, they don't fuck with me, but they value AI. It's pretty cool right now. So I see that discomfort and, like, disconnect and inability to deal with the future that they have created themselves, I would say. And then, man, I'm in India, and now I get a sense of the future. I see a beautiful ancient people, man, that has, I think, the basis of a civilization that can take them towards the future for the world, and is an example of what must become in the United States. So when I'm talking about ancient people, man, it's like all over the place. I'm talking like I'm driving down a road in a highway, and there's like this magnificent tree in the middle of a highway. I'm like, why you guys do that? why did she cut the tree down? No, man. This is an ancient tree. This tree is older than the United States. You can build a road. You're not going to cut the tree down.
Right.
And so, this to me is like the physical manifestation of, that ancient culture, philosophy, and civilization that no matter what kind of technological progress or material wealth that is produced, they will not be severed from it, and they will not cut it down. They will not allow that to happen to themselves. And then I'm just like, I'm learning about India as it developed, and I'm seeing it in real time. And you got all these people who they're not even able to really talk to each other all the time. I'm like, hey, Roger, what does that sign read? And he's like, I can't read that, man. That, my language from a linguistic perspective is closer to English than it is to that language.
Indo-European. And this is not Indo-European.
He's like, I can't talk to these people. I can't read it. And yet, like, I'm sitting here, and there's like a certain coherence to this society, and there's a certain harmony amongst the people. There's a little bit of chaos because there's a lot of people, but overall, I feel like I'm amongst a people.
Right.
And then I'm learning that, oh man, in my ignorance, the history of India, you have all these different, like, tribes or even kingdoms that developed in parallel with one another, sometimes at war with one another. And yet, like, now, like, there's like no basis of conflict off of this historical development. And then I'm learning, oh wow, you had the Islamic rule where you had the Mongols. They like came down, and they were like quite brutal at first, and extra, location wise, external to India. And they also really looked to like the Persian people. That was like their aspiration. Yeah. So, they come from one place, they aspire to another, but then ultimately, like, they become Indian. They like are like inextricably part of like the Indian people. It's part of the fabric of society. You see it in the way the buildings are built. You got the masjid over here. You have the the beautiful people in their ethnic dress, and then you have the other beautiful people. They're dressed a little differently, and like no matter like what the past historical constitution of different places were, or people that came from the outside, ultimately all of them became Indian. There was this basis of civilization that I would say, civilize a more barbarous people. When I'm talking about the pillaging from Mongolia, and then can account for all these like different tribes who can't even speak to one another, or these kingdoms that were at war with one another. And yet there was a basis for contact, and then for a oneness. I struggle to probe deep like into the consciousness of many people, because I don't speak the language, right? Although people speak to me, because it's such a varied country that they have every phenotype present. So if I don't say anything, people just think that I'm Indian. But that like civilizational basis to make a people out of so many different peoples, whether you're already there, or whether you're coming in, I mean, it's really varied, man. I was eating at a Persian restaurant. Apparently, they had some Persian people that fled the Zoroastrians. I think they like worship fire, and now they're out there, and so there's no conflict. There's no religious conflict, and I really see it. For example, I went to Laura, these like magnificent caves that started off as Buddhist caves that they carved into. And then the Hindus came in, and then they did their thing, building off of what the Buddhists did. And then the Jains came in, and they kept going at it too. And I have all these different people around me that are actually followers of these different religions, and yet they're like praying to like all of the different statues and like deities. You have the Buddhists praying to the Hindu statues, and vice versa.
The Buddha's praying to the Hindu statues.
Yeah. And I'm like, yo, is this blasphemous? I don't really understand these religions. What's going on here? And she's like, no, this is people that are predisposed and searching for the truth, and they will accept it in whatever form it takes. And so, yes, they'll pray to the different statue, because what that God, what that deity represents of the way the nature of the universe and the nature of man and woman and humankind speaks to them, and they cannot help but make it their own. When faced with the truth, they cannot deny the truth. And so, that it's hard for me to truly describe what Indian civilization is. I'm only there for 2 weeks, right? There's levels to it that I wanna know more about. But there being like that basis for a oneness, I think in the United States, the parallel would have to be Black America and this civilization and potentiality. I think under that basis, you can bring in all peoples from the world, as we are trying to do right now. And the way I see it, I think that certainly when you brought in all these different peoples, you had to give up something of yourself to, but then you were able to gain so much more in becoming a people. And then ultimately, I think each of these different groups gave to Indian civilization and inextricably changed it as they became Indian. Whether you're like a Mongolian or if you're Southern Indian, Northern Indian. And I think that can be a model for the way that all of the world's people that have found themselves in the United States can become Black. And I guess my last stop was in Doha. I had like 24 hours there, and it was really like clean, man. It like smelled good everywhere, man. They like mastered views, very highly developed, but like only like they have like 11% of the population is like Qatari. And then the rest of the population are like immigrants from all over the world come there for various degrees of work, whether you're like doing hard labor, or whether you're like in tech or finance. And honestly, like the country is like run very well. They have a lot of technological progress, but the way that they like ultimately sustain themselves is is right now trying to cultivate an elite of their own. Like I think they used to be like wandering Bedouin people who formed a state in cooperation with the British. That's why they were able to export petroleum and not get toppled like Gaddafi. And so, they made this kind of deal with the devil. And now the state is for the few, despite there being many in the world there. And similar, like United States, a lot of people came from different parts, but there, they don't actually, of what they consider a citizen of their own people is not really a worker. And so they have to rely upon the fruits of another civilization to sustain them, as opposed to their own.
Yeah.
And so as nice as it looks for right now, it's very comfortable to visit. I think that they will face a similar decline. All the Gulf Arab states, like Europe, going down this trajectory. And so I think civilization must follow, or I think countries and peoples must follow civilizational path. And we're fortunate here in the United States that we have this civilization and potentiality that we must bring into being, and the capacity to draw from the world's people as well.
I like listening to you speak, especially when you were describing how different religions and different civilizational traditions synthesize really well in Indian civilization. Because it actually makes me think about, for example, with Europe. I think it's very different where darker people who go to Europe, I feel like very few, with the exception of the elite, could actually become European in the way that you're describing that people can become Indian. And obviously, if we take like our experience in the US, I think it's also the same with like it's only through the Black tradition that a colored people could synthesize their own civilization. Because it even reminded me of when Baldwin was describing the Arabs in France and how the French despised the Arab people because they never saw themselves as French. Never saw themselves in their identity as France. But even back to like Nuri's original remarks and like some of the discussion earlier, I think the question that I really had was why, or the thing that really stood out to me is why is European civilization exhausted? And it made me think back to Du Bois in The World in Africa when he talks about the imperative for the study of African civilization and how an omission of it in world history has distorted world thought or world scientific thought or world philosophy. And then some of the earliest chapters are about Europe specifically, like the collapse of Europe, which is to establish like why the world wars, what it did to Europe, and then the next chapter, White Masters of the World, where I think he really talks about the color line having produced this paradox in European civilization. But then I was thinking like for the last 70, 80 years since Du Bois put out that thesis, I don't know if I would call it a collapse of Europe anymore, so much as back to what Purba had said, like, how come nothing new can be produced by the original white nations? And I want to think about it more because I don't think I have the answer now, but like I find it so interesting as an example in world history of how a civilization can be exhausted when you still have a people.
And you still have the people.
You still have 8 people. And the idea should be that like there's vitality and there's a future among the people, such as I think is like very organically observed in a country like India, or even in a city like Philadelphia. Like there's human vitality. And so I think it's evidence for the color line as like the primary contradiction of modernity that I don't know if at this point Europe can ever unlock until it is unlocked within America first. But then even then, I don't know what would happen to European civilization. But I guess in a different way, it's to say that I find like our discussion of the world situation is promising to me in some ways, or gives me more confidence that our assertion that really world humanity, but especially colored world humanity, is still searching for the Black proletariat, I think is really relevant for the coming year and for the future. Well, for example, this came up a lot with our study of the music. And it was something that we had already observed a lot over time, but I think became more crystallized, which is that, like, whether it's East Asia or Southeast Asia or elsewhere, the world's people gravitate to modern Black music in a way that is phenomenal. Like, it's like a phenomenon. And I think it took us time to say that really different civilizations in different ways are searching for the philosophic key that would actually take on and reconcile the question of what the color line has done to the human being or civilization in the 20th and 21st century. And I think the role that Black music plays in the consciousness of the world's people is one evidence to that. But then I think, like, based off of today's discussion, it was this point about Europe that was actually standing out a lot to me. And how can it be that Europe, which was the crown jewel of world civilization for at least a few centuries following the Renaissance, it's flat. It's totally flatlined. And I don't even think I've appreciated that fully in the way that we see the world situation. And I even wonder how the European leaders see the developments of the colored world, like Russia and China and Africa. And that's something that I haven't looked into as much. But I think this thing that, like, Europe has become very frozen in myths, or the original doctrine of white supremacy or white superiority really does emerge from Europe. And I think they're still frozen there in many ways. But I think there was one more thing I wanted to say. Well, I think the last thing I wanted to say is, like, Doc, I've been, like, struggling to keep up a little bit with all of your developments in, like, logic and in the American Revolution and capitalism, but I did get the capitalism book, and I also find it, like, pretty interesting for the reasons that you described. First, that he's a Harvard professor, and he's from Germany originally, but he works as an American intellectual now. But from the introduction, he's already establishing himself from a new departure point, saying that, like, this is not an Adam Smith interpretation. It's also not a Karl Marx interpretation. This is my attempt to understand the world historic development of capitalism in the moment of a new stage in history. And I find that remarkable for a Western intellectual, elite intellectual, to take that position. But then I think that our framework will also really be complemented by a study of that book, is my feeling, because I mean, concepts like King's World House or civilization, I think, help us understand that, because even in one of the first few pages, it sounds like a King's speech where he's saying, before you started your morning, you've already gotten your coffee from Brazil and your sweater from Cambodia and whatever, like your kettle from China. And he talks about how capitalism and its development can only be explained by something like civilization, because it could not have propagated itself and become embedded in the social life of the world's peoples had there not been a deeper structure that is more than economic that could cradle all of this. And so, for example, he would say, like, the way that capitalism manifests in India would then draw from the traditions in which Indian workers related to one another, or Indian hierarchies were already structured, etc. So I think I don't know if what I'm saying is that useful, but I guess like the new ground we're breaking is exciting to me, and it's also, I also find it very complex, because I think that we're really trying to deal with the domestic and the world situation, and advancing, you know, it's just, yeah, I find this very advanced and difficult.
Well, I wanted to I had a couple of points to make. The first thing is that Eddie's journey kind of also reminded me that last time I was going back to India, I was stranded in Doha for a day because I missed my flight, and I think I observed a lot of the same things that you did. The population of Doha is very minimally Qatari, and the hotel that they put me up in, the concierge was Lebanese, the person who handled the bags was Bangladeshi, the cook was from Thailand. And I tried to speak to all of them and try to get an idea of how they were integrating into a society like this. And I think that the contradictions between these people in a country like Doha is relatively little in comparison to America. And I haven't thought about it as much till this conversation today. But I think that Eddie has a point that there is this overlap and sort of synthesis of a lot of different civilizations in a lot of different countries all over the world, and here we are in America where we're trying to reach for something, we're trying to have something similar, but the direction is very unclear. And I think that this has to be understood in terms of civilization. Like with respect to the conversation that you and Kathy were having about the NOI, Michelle, Johan, and I had the opportunity to have an interview with Gregory Muhammad of the NOI. And he said something towards the end of that interview, which I found really interesting. I didn't really know about it. That when they say the Asiatic black man, they're not really talking about the color black, but when they say black, they mean the darkness out of which all life comes. and
It's deep.
in essence, they're talking about Africa as that dark nation out of which all life comes. So their language is very civilizational. Their language is very reminiscent of both what was the ancient and what will be. And I feel like this is the reason why I feel like the NOI and the Free School have become very close, because we share something along that ideology of looking at things through a civilizational basis. And in contrast, I think looking and reading the national security strategy, I felt that even though, and Nuri did a really good job of pointing out everything that was important. I especially like that she looked at the previous national security strategies and contrasted this one with it, because a lot of what was not there in this one also reflects a lot. There was not that usual rhetoric about China and Russia that we were talking about. There's not the usual rhetoric about Israel is our greatest ally and Taiwan needs to be independent. Over the last couple of years, we've had, well, at least a social media fueled panic about two world wars, one involving Israel and Iran and one involving China and Taiwan. And those were big things that people were sort of really, really catastrophizing. And to not have it here, I think, is significant. That is not something that they're thinking about. I feel like the Trump administration knows that it needs to break from Europe, but it is unsure of what to do after that. You know, it's like you have a fight at home and you get out of the house and you get into a car and drive off into the night, not knowing where you're going. It's kind of like that, but there is a place that you can go. There is one house, and that's the world house that will admit anybody. And I feel like the Black proletariat is the center of that house, where America can go to find a kind of future, a kind of direction. I felt like the entire strategy was really searching for something, even though it was trying to make really bold claims and assertions. It was really searching for something. Even the way that the contents are kind of laid out, they're all in the form of questions. And I don't think that America has the answers yet, but there is in America that potential to find these answers in the Black working class, in the Black proletariat, and in their imaginary. And I was actually really glad that I reread Nuri's article before I read the Thomas Friedman article that you sent me. And it really helped me understand his article a little more clearly, because in my opinion, I think that Thomas Friedman is, when he makes the claim of civilizational war, he's trying to say that this is the way that America is looking to build its civilization.
No, he's saying that's what Trump wants.
That's what Trump wants.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, the entire reason I bring this up is because reading Nuri's article, I think that this is what I was texting you last night, that I think that civilizational war is a paradox.
Yes.
Like, you cannot have a civilization built out of war. You cannot, and you can have like what Israel is doing.
I see what you're saying.
Right? What Israel is doing to Gaza, we can term it as a civilization war because it's trying to end it. What we're trying to do is build one, and we can't have it through war. And this question of whose home it is, like this question of the American population is trying to figure out who can call this place a home. I thought that it is relevant for today, maybe, but he also asserts that that was the question of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement as well. Who can call America its home?
Right.
And I have a slight disagreement with that because I feel like the question was never if Black people can call America their home. I think that they knew that it was their home, and the struggle was to establish that truth. The struggle, like Baldwin, Robeson, King, everybody has said that it is on the backs of the Black proletariat that this country was built, and they have every right to be a part of this society, a part of this country, as much as anyone else. And that is the truth, that is cold hard fact. And the struggle was to establish that, to get people to have, the revolution was, as Ting said, in the moral sphere, in the moral realm, that people can accept this fact and not, academically hammer home the fact that, these are the reasons why. It was already established. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was, I think that, Doc, when you said that civilization is the manifestation of the history of consciousness, I think because I was also trying to figure out what does civilization mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to another person I talk to? What are the differences in how we think about this concept, this category? And that reminded me of Tagore. And Tagore has been on my mind because I recently saw Raju Nandita's interview with Uma Dasgupta and about the university that Tagore established in Shantiniketan, which was like a really modern experiment of synthesizing civilization. It was, a bridging of Eastern and Western civilization. It was a deliberate effort to create something modern, synthesizing, the Indian cultural heritage with European modernity. And Tagore has been on my mind because when he was 80 years old in the last year of his life in 1941, he gave this speech, which has been transcribed, and it was called A Crisis in Civilization. And in it, he sort of makes the assertion that civilization is the moral and spiritual progress of humanity, striving for unity, harmony, and love. And I think I can get behind that. I can get behind that idea. It is sort of reminiscent of what you said, a history of consciousness, also the history of the spirituality and morality of humanity. And he contrasts that with the ideal of the destructive Western nations, the nationalism and the imperialism and materialism of the West. And I think that this national security strategy is kind of trying to make America go very chaotically down that route yet again, of this nationalist destructive route. Tagore warned of absolute global collapse if humanity somehow lost its, moral kernel or this ethical core. And he really did advocate India's, and all of this is apropos to what Eddie was also talking about. He was really advocating for India's spiritual wisdom and their belief in universal humanism. He uses this very interesting word to describe Indian civilization. He calls it a syncretic civilization. And I didn't know what that meant, but
syncretic meaning unity of different.
I had to look it up. But
Okay.
but in the way that Tagore is trying to sort of formulate it is how India, as this syncretic civilization, has the ability to foster unity amidst diversity. And it points to what Eddie was talking about, so many different kinds of people, so many diverse cultures and traditions, and yet there is harmony, yet there is a sense of unity. And I think that when Tagore wrote this, he was very, very aware that European civilization was collapsing. And he wanted to say that we have a lot to learn from you, but you also have a lot to learn from us.
Well, I wanted to pick up on what you said about civilization as a manifestation of the history of the consciousness of a people, because in some ways part of what we are, or the context of this discussion is, why are people drawn to talk about civilization in this time in the first place? And that was in part the question that Mary asked at the beginning of her essay 2 years ago, which is not just about what do we think about it, but why are different people of different countries, different places, different ideological interests even, why are they drawn into this discussion about civilization? Why is it a term that has arisen to the forefront of world discourse, where it's not just Trump who's using it, but it is a Xi Jinping or a Putin or a Modi who would use this idea of civilization? And actually, it's if you think about it as a term, or civilizations themselves as reflecting, as you said, the history of the consciousness of a people, then it's if you put that against the concept of civilization, it's like a reflective quality. It's like consciousness reflecting upon itself. Does that make sense?
Or feedback loop.
Feedback loop. So it's like there's I don't know, there's like a mirror quality which I find very interesting. It's a self-conscious term. And so in some ways it's like it shows whether it's the negative example of like the Western elite or the other examples of the darker world taking up this idea of civilization today, it's a sign of self-consciousness. Does that make sense? And it's also a sign of, I think, like my feeling for it as like a general idea is like, it's a consciousness also of like time and of like this being a, Xi Jinping has this term of great change is not seen within a century. He uses that idea, he uses that language a lot. But it's like, in a way that Trump can't ignore it, definitely like the more, like the advanced parts of the darker world are also embracing it. It's like, that humanity itself is part, like that it's moving through a very unique time in the world's history, and that the concept of civilization is needed to reflect the significance and the scope and the stakes of what will become the outcome of this period of humanity's history, if that makes sense.
No, do it again.
Like, it's
I'm sorry.
because one of the things that Neri says in the essay is that civilization is kind of side by side with the big capital letter category of history. For example, civilization is with capital C. It's a reflection of like a people saying this is our long history. This is why China, Chinese theorists, politicians, ordinary people will often talk about a 5,000-year-long continuous history of Chinese civilization. It's a category that carries with it the weight of a people's history, the weight of time, in which the values that people embody in the present day carry with them these reverberations and literally like the weight of time. And so in some ways, like,
You said the weight of time, you mean the weight of history?
the weight of history, sorry, the weight of history. And so if this is a moment in humanity's history when people are conscious that there are great changes taking place, changes that have an implication both for the preceding, let's say, 500-year period of Western domination, but also for the future of humanity, then it's like you need a concept that is able to convey and communicate the grand scale of historical time, in which carries that weight. And I don't know if that makes sense, but like, it's like there's a, in some ways it's like, let's say if class struggle was one of the big categories of like world discourse, world discussion, world consciousness 100 years ago. Like, why is it that civilization feels like there's this pull that people feel towards this idea in this time? And to me, it's like, it is this feeling of like, no one knows what the outcome is going to be, but there are these great changes that are taking place in the world. And I connected to, it is connected to what we would call, like this age of Europe ending and then something new starting. And like, even when we talk about like the spread of capitalism, the birth of modernity, and why we identify the color line, as we have said, as the central problem for modernity, it's that, let's say, actually, like the Ken Burns documentary has been very illuminating in this sense. It's like, even when like the Native Americans first encountered the Europeans, and this is before the modern concept of race had really been consolidated, right? Because this is pre-1776, this is pre-Reconstruction, pre-Jim Crow. And it's like, still, these Native Americans, and you can say the same for like, obviously the enslaved African proletariat, it's like, they're like, these white men have come to our shores. And like, this is an experience around the world, whether it is capitalism spreading to other parts of the world, or like in some ways being constituted by other parts of the world. It's like, when colonialism happens, like like the darker peoples of the world receive it as a foreign civilization, a foreign race imposing itself upon them. And I don't know if I'm like, that's probably a very basic assertion, but it's like, I think it's that sense of like what Du Bois calls race contact, civilizational contact, which is in part the problem, which is that colonialism means like a civilization taking it upon itself to impose itself on the rest of the world. That is in some ways the form or like the consequence of the spread of what we call like capitalism. And it's like, and so then this new problem emerges of like, what is, I mean, what you guys were talking about, like even in Qatar, right? Like what is going to be the outcome of this great meeting of the world's peoples that has not really been possible before? Because, and the last thing is just that, for example, like I was thinking about like this idea, like, you know, Lenin's concept of imperialism. And actually something I find really like, that's really helpful when I read it before was like, what Lenin in that time was attempting to describe with like this whole, the monopoly state of capitalism, the world, like really like this like eruption on the world stage of war. Like, it's like, rather than talking about it in terms of the divisions in the world, what Lenin is really interested in is like what connects the world. And so he's trying to look at capitalism as this system that creates all of these vast and complicated connections between different parts of the world. And in some ways, like what we're trying to take up is like a similar question of what is it that connects humanity in this time, both in a negative way, but also in the potential ways for the future. I don't know, I kind of veered off, but yeah, I don't know, I was interested in like, okay, why are people talking about civilization? And this being, if civilization itself is a concept that itself reflects something about the history of consciousness, then there's a kind of reflective quality to it. So yeah.
Well, I wanted to, I mean, I think, I guess what I'm struggling with this concept of civilization is that when we think, or previously when I thought of civilization, I thought of India and China as being these long civilizations. But I almost think that actually, I go back actually to King of what he meant when he said to inject meaning, or that from the Montgomery bus boycotts, how is it that Black folk had injected a new meaning to civilization? And the reason why I bring that up is because I think in this time, I used to think there was a definition for civilization, but I think it's in this period where the world has changed so rapidly, and there's a crisis actually among Western civilization, that the search is actually, or the question before is, what does civilization mean? And I even think when King was saying like injecting meaning into civilization, he's saying injecting morality into the meaning of civilization. Because I do think there was this thing of a white civilization or a Western civilization where civilization is actually built on immorality. And yeah, and or a civilization that is, I guess what Michelle was saying, which is like white civilization is a people who saw themselves as superior to others. But that's the change in the meaning of civilization, where there's an element to morality. I think in the case of China, what's interesting is actually, I think China is going through this question where it does have this long history of, but the thing that it faces is that the past several decades have also been big changes to its society. And as it's facing those changes, now it has to bring forward what is China or Chinese civilization mean?
Who are we after?
Yeah, like because you can't really just go back to Confucius or the time where it was a feudal system where people were more, because the reality is that people now are increasingly connected. In China, there is this question of what is the role consumerism and materialism in this interconnected, in a modern way. And so you can't just go back to Confucius or where you live simple and in the woods and, you know, preach. Yeah, and I think that's why it's this question of like, okay, like our country has developed rapidly. Our youth also face this question of they're seeing the West, they're seeing the world. Some want to go to France because they think, like there's this thing on the internet, which is like Chinese people as some, like a fraction of Chinese people wanting to go to a more idyllic place, like France, like France, Italy, countryside, and seeing that as something as Western. But then there was a saying, it was interesting because this commentator basically was like, actually, no, like China had this idyllic thing of being in the countryside, being, you know, Zen and all of that. But the thing is, like, the changes of capitalism have made the pace of life so much quicker. And so, I guess what I was trying to say is that I think with the economic development of China, which has been linked to this world financial capitalist system, now it's also dealing with the effects of that, which is what are the values of our people? Some of those values that our parents have are not necessarily the same ones that the youth have nowadays. And as it continues to, as it's part of this global system, and as it continues to develop, like what is that thing that unites Chinese people still? And oh shoot, what was I gonna say? And that's really, and I think even going back to the original, like where we started with this conversation, which is like with white folk, and it's also embodied, or like embodying someone like Trump, embodying in the security, what is it called again? The national security strategy, is that in order to move forward, you also have to have an accurate assessment of history and of people. And I mean, what's clear in the document, and it's also clear, like the schizophrenia with Trump as well, is that there's always this return to the past of how great it was and how blah, 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 blah. But it wasn't always great. And what were the contradictions of the time that need to be resolved? And I mean, we keep saying in free school that it is the contradictions in 1776 that had to be followed through with Reconstruction, the Civil War, the Black freedom struggle. The other thing that was interesting, shoot. Oh man, it's slipping. Oh, yes. I mean, I think what's the question, I think it's also through our study of Black gods and deindustrialization, is this, like, what is the way forward? Which is this trialectic between white folk, Black folk, I guess the planter, capitalist, ruling elite, whatever, right? But I think the question, the open question is there, among ordinary white folk and Black folk, is there a way for them to actually develop a relationship or to know each other? And because I don't know, like this is like the national, or I guess the Afrocentrist, which is like, can Black folk alone do it in this country? Or actually, do you actually need a fraction of the people of this country, which are white folk? And I do think it's really encouraging, actually, which is, or what is different is that white civilization is losing its appeal, because back during, prior to the Third American Revolution, there were white folk, like ordinary white folk, that always aspired to a different class, or didn't see actually that it was the worker, it is the masses of people that build a nation. But is there still that same aspiration among white folk today? Or are they actually searching for what Black folk have been saying all along, which is that we're part of a human family, that we have to look towards the world, that we have to, I mean, essentially be honest and loving and see each other, or for man to know man. And it is always encouraging when Emily always talks about like her white union members who seem Black, because they are not only impoverished, but then they are interacting with Black folk as well. And I don't think there's that same aspiration to be part of the ruling elite. Is actually them seeing the strengths actually of ordinary people too. And you can correct me if you're wrong. But essentially, like, is the future, there is a future for America if ordinary people in America, the masses are able to know one another and to know this history and actually to build a democracy. Like what would be the national security strategy be if it was formulated by ordinary white and Black folk? Is it a security strategy, or is it I don't know, what else would you say?
I mean, the national security itself is a misnomer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the whole reason for the document is empire strategy.
May I ask Alice a question?
I'd love to jump into.
Can I just ask a question, Emily? You're talking about Chinese civilization, and I don't know whether you would say there's a crisis of Chinese civilization or crisis of, let's say, the younger generation's identification with whatever Chinese civilization is. Do you, and I asked this also of Emily and Kathy, would you see the Cultural Revolution, I'm not talking about all of its excesses and wildness, but would you see its initiation as a struggle over Chinese civilization?
The Cultural Revolution specifically?
Which would have, in other words, let us say Mao and those had won. What would have been the civilizational trajectory of China? Were they fighting for different civilizational trajectory? You know, I mean, maybe they weren't, maybe, but was the Cultural Revolution and all of the destruction, and because don't forget they attacked the universities,
Museums,
they attacked
temples.
they attacked elites, and you know, of course, Mao, you can read his writings and his stuff. He did have, I mean, China would look, if he had been successful, China would not look like it does today, because he was very anti-Western. I mean, ruthlessly anti, and he never wanted to travel to the West either. But I just asked, what would, I don't know how you are.
I mean, that's interesting, because I think with the Cultural Revolution, Mao was trying to leap over stages of
Well,
development
that's true too.
in the people's consciousness, which is that I think, I mean, this is a simplification, but it's like anti-Western, but also anti-elite, in the sense where I guess my grandma was like, yeah, we were told to like yell at our teachers, or like that they were too too bourgeois, and it's all just farmers and workers, and those are the values that a whole society should have. But can you, at a time when China is so poor, having gone through a revolution, can you automatically
Big question.
can you automatically say like everyone automatically believes that in this, you know, no family structure, every child is everyone's, or are there stages of development where, you know, the question of poverty, which I guess Deng Xiaoping was addressing.
But we're back to the old problem of inequalities and hierarchies in China. Even so much that Xi Jinping and those had, his government had to outlaw these special classes of elites to get their children into elite universities. You know, so you have this problem, which Mao thought could be resolved, it seems to me. You're right, by a leap over socioeconomic stages and and the establishment first of the cultural and civilizational foundations of China, and then come back to the economic. Go
Do
ahead.
you want to say? So I feel you asked two questions, and I wanted to go back to your first one about how do we see today? Is it a crisis of Chinese civilization? I feel that like to see this in the context or like with the context of the Cultural Revolution and then even the Chinese Revolution and then the Center of Humiliation before where we are after like Deng Xiaoping's reforms and opening. I feel that a lot of the questions that face like China isn't necessarily to me a crisis of civilization as much as like crisis in modernity in general. And I feel like many societies are all asking the same questions of like, is it now that our young people, and we ask this even here, but I feel that every country is now asking this, like, is it now that as our youth become more educated, are the values to be, and this great question of like, what is the role of Western culture, civilization, hangs over all of us, but hang over China precipitously for a reason because it is so like facing a lot of important like crises around like, or like problems. I wouldn't even say if it's a crisis, because to me, when I go to China, the problems are vast. Like, how are we going to employ like a much bigger population of young people graduating from college? They all want to go to college for the most part. Some of them don't, but how are we going to do it if like technology is going this way, like the paths towards modernity, industrialization, even like, you know, an information age, all this, like, can you employ everybody with also AI in the mix? Can you, as you were saying, have enough people to take care of this aging population? Like, these are not unique to China to me, but they hang over China in a dramatic way because it is like 1.5 billion people. And like how civilization is going to play a role even in resolving those questions, will or will not play a role in those questions, are kind of, it's just similar to me in terms of even the West asking some of these questions, but not even there yet because there's so much chaos, there's so much, like there's this complexity
But
too.
let me ask this question. I know I get from you and Alice, there's always, when you come back, there's a kind of discomfort with what you see. I know Alice is always talking about the young people are too materialistic. And I know, just picking up from you, you're very encouraged whenever you see Chinese young people wearing traditional dress. So I always pick up that there's something that unsettles you all. Is that fair to say? And so that's what, and I don't know how you see these problems, but are you afraid that they can get out of control? I don't know if I'm making myself all that clear.
Well, I mean, I think there's also a difference because Kathy and I are in larger cities of China Kathy and I are in larger cities of China where the economic development is also much more and has been, or not economic development, but it's more, you have cities where there's a lot of shopping going around, a lot more wealth as well. But I don't know if it's the same in more rural areas. And I think it's the question that I think King also grapples with, which is the development, like the economic development of men, but also the moral development, and how both, how do you trade off or balance both of those? Because how is it that you've gone to a country where people are so have been so focused on developing the country and material wealth that you don't lose some of that? Recently they just not executed. I think he was like these like 2 higher officials in the party or some companies as well that had like swindled or someone, and they were sentenced to be executed.
That's capital punishment.
Say it again.
Capital punishment. Well, to me, I feel like you described the quality of going to China
better actually than I was trying to grasp towards, which is more so that like there are big questions facing Chinese Chinese society, but I wouldn't call them a crisis as they present themselves in America.
It could become.
They could, but they're at different stages. I would just
This
feel
is
like
very
I
interesting.
just don't feel that it's in
Yeah.
like this complete free fall.
I agree with you.
Maybe
Go ahead, Kath. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
talk over you.
I just feel that they're like, I would put them almost as like questions or problems,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't call them
Yeah.
crises the way
Yeah.
this country's clearly in a
Yeah.
crisis.
Yes.
This document is so incoherent, but I
Yes.
feel that these are really important
Yes.
ones to.
Well, I mean, the crisis also goes back, I'm sorry, the crisis also goes back to the question of the state as well.
This is what I
Because
was
there's
gonna
going to be questions and contradictions in any society.
Right.
But is there the presence of a state that is responsive to these questions and able to address them with the people? And I think it only becomes a crisis when it doesn't, if the state isn't able
Yes, I
to
agree.
address the needs of the people, the way it is in Europe, in the US, where people are suffering, people are confused, people are upset, and the state just does not care, or either does not care, is trying to conceal it, so forth.
Yes.
Very perfect.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I'm loving this conversation. I don't really much at all.
A little bit.
Oh yeah, I have a lot of reading to do with the Chinese civilization. But yeah, just thinking, moving back around to the American, the crisis of America that we're in. I just wanted to like tie together some threads that I've been hearing. I love Alice when you said, like, is there a way for us to actually know each other? White worker and the black worker. Like, how do we actually, build that consciousness for each other, right? And then I think Eddie, you were talking about earlier. You said giving up something of yourself, but then you have to, but then gaining so much more, right? So yeah, I'm loving like these 2 quotes from y'all, but yeah, I guess what's always in my mind, and it was, I think Doc, you were talking about this earlier, is this focus on whiteness as like a Western civilizational mentality, or like almost like whiteness as like a cultural logic. And so like I think that that's maybe an interesting formulation. And I wanted to bring in like I have these 2 notebooks. I try to put in my book reading into like one notebook, and then sort of my my sort of community notes and different. But I was just flipping through my book notebook, and I found Noel Ignatieff, I think his name is. Ignatieff.
How the Irish became white.
Yes, which I still haven't read, which I need to read that one. But I actually recently picked up his Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity book, which is like,
what's the title of it?
It's called Treason to Whiteness is Loyalty to Humanity, and it's actually a book of essays. Yeah. I don't actually know if he compiled the essays or if it was a different editor. It may have been.
When was it published?
2017-ish, I think.
70s?
No, 2017-ish.
Because I think he died maybe around that same time.
2019, he died in 2019.
Yeah.
He's from Philadelphia.
Oh, yeah? Oh, that's great. But yeah, so I want to read just a bit from his essay that's called Race or Class, ? So I want to get to that quote, but I just wanted to loop in with Doc, you were saying before about this kind of the psychological benefits of whiteness are no longer serving white people. The notion of developing mechanisms of the realization of this, right? Like white folks understand that these psychological benefits are lessening. But how do they build an analysis around that, right? Because of course, a lot of those people are going to the MAGA sect, right? But how do we bring them over to our sector, our side, right? The epistemological conditions of those white working class people, to come to the realization that they have more in common with the Black working class, right? But then it's this like question of like the psychological benefits of whiteness. If it's a civilizational, if whiteness is a civilizational mentality, then that means not only white people have it, right? Not only white people are captured by whiteness, right? And so then we ask, okay, what sections of like Black people or any other type of people, right? Other races, how are they all still aspiring to whiteness or still trying to find these psychological benefits? Like how are non-white people still aspiring to whiteness in our country today? And so that brings me to the quote, the Ignatieff, I'm not pronouncing it right, Ignatieff quote, where he's sort of going back and forth between the race and class, right? It's like which one do we sort of like preference or whatever? And he says, the immiseration of the Black poor and the existence of a privileged layer of Black professionals in previously white spaces appear to be in conflict. How could such progress exist alongside such misery? We've come a long way, say the pundits, but there's still a long way to go. That is a completely wrong-headed way to look at it. In fact, there is a necessary connection between the two phenomena. Neither could exist without the other. That is, without the Black faces behind desks, no force could stop the masses of the Black poor from tearing the country apart. And on the other hand, without the threat of the Black poor, there would be no Black faces behind desks. To understand the relationship between Black progress and Black genocide is the heart of class analysis today. So I just found that extremely powerful.
To understand the relationship between Black, and
yes, the immiseration of the Black poor and the existence of a privileged layer of Black professionals, right? So Black proletariat versus
you
Black
said and genocide. Did you say genocide?
Yes,
progress
between Black progress and Black genocide. So I just see this quote as this grappling with this idea of Black faces behind desks, or like this Black professionals in previously white spaces, integration, all of that, as like this idea of like Black people who are aspiring to whiteness or who are captured inside whiteness, or this idea that you have to, do certain things in order to be, legitimate in society. And so, yeah, I guess that's just like kind of like an existential question of that I'm just really interested in. I see this group as like a really powerful conversation space for this. And I think maybe this group can, like, because of the focus on the Black proletariat, right? Is it like that the Black proletariat is clearly, like, obviously not aspiring to whiteness, like for obvious reasons, and it's only the Black middle class and upper class, right? It's only the people who are trying to, right, like make more money than they need to survive or whatever. Is it those people that are still captured, or is the Black proletariat actually captured too? I don't know. That's just an interesting question.
But just a small thing. The Black elite, if you will, the highly educated, aspiring elite, in a certain sense, have separated from the Black masses and have connected
on the basis of class and education with this upper layer, and they will espouse something like multiculturalism, DEI, affirmative action, but they find themselves in a competition, let us say, with Indian elites who have outdistanced everybody in terms of, I mean, if you're talking about behind desks. So I would say that part of the bargain to enter the elite is to adopt white supremacists or assumptions about white supremacy or the white supremacist social system, which the poor and the proletariat do not have that luxury. I mean, because the aspiration towards whiteness for them, well, you could see it around, leads nowhere. So they have, I would say even, there are two different discourses about progress at this time that were not the case if you went back 30 or 40 years ago.
If I may make some respond.
No, I'm here.
Yeah, just a final commentary. I like a lot of what you posed towards the end, Jeremiah and Mary, about the task that the concept of civilization has now that we live in a world system that was produced by the rise of Europe and white supremacy.
Right.
And like the civilization has to be able to account for like the presence of white supremacy in the world, as well as the people like being in contact with each other like never before in the world. Like even if you live in a minor city in like India, like you actually do, and there's no white people around you, like you do have to contend with what the white world has produced and put out there for the development of your society. And then you also have to contend with, like, for example, man, it was beautiful to see you. I'm driving around and I see all these pictures of Putin and Modi shaking hands, man. I see all these billboards that they rented out and on the TV. And it's beautiful, it's beautiful. And on the one hand, you want to both try to free yourself or remove yourself from the oppression of the white supremacist world system, but at the same time, you don't want to become decadent as a society. Like I honestly a little bit in Qatar, to be honest. And I think that this is a question that will confront all the world's peoples as they rise. I mean, India is growing and they're becoming economically more advanced. China has become much more economically advanced. And it's something I'm excited about to think about for like the new year to kind of answer this question for civilization is what Cuba decided they wanted to be as a civilization that wanted to become part of the world revolutionary process for freedom against white supremacy. That needed to be the ultimate direction and aspiration for your country, especially if you have economic development and prosperity and a lot of these problems of hunger and poverty solved. But even if you don't have it all the way solved, like if you as a people are not able to deal with white supremacy at this ultimate level, then I don't think that the country has worked out enough of a path of the future. And I'm interested in how that pertains to developing both on like a continuation of your civilization, and then what I think Black America especially worked out was a production of something new. Given that white supremacy as a world system is an aberration of history, unprecedented in human history. I don't think it's possible to just try to completely develop on civilizational lines as currently exists like within your society. And I think I mean, as I currently see the world, I think like all countries to be able to deal with white supremacy as a world system need what Black America has produced. And at the same time, I do believe that they themselves have the capacity to be generative and contribute something new to that as well, as Cuba was able to do.
Oh yeah, wait, I'm sorry.
Do you want to respond to Eddie?
Yeah, that's
Go
good.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, actually, Eddie, bringing up Cuba, I really like that formulation of, that you just said, Eddie, of, if you haven't, Cuba shows that if you haven't worked out white supremacy, like you said, it would be difficult to have a future. But then in some ways, you're also saying,
So if you haven't worked it out,
if you as a people are unable to work out white supremacy, it would be difficult to have a path forward. But in another way, you could even say like, if you haven't worked out white supremacy, it would be difficult to even work out the economy, which tends to be seen as such a simple, one of the more simple systems, or like more primary systems to work out. And the reason why that was illuminating to me was because I've been trying the whole time today, I've been trying to like figure out this thing that was brought up about like that the global origins of capitalism is also associated with the global origins of the proletariat itself.
Right.
And I was like, because I basically feel like there's something interesting in that. And I connected it to our conversation of civilization because Baldwin in Notes in the House of Bondage says this like small thing that I paid a lot of attention. I only like paid attention to this morning when I read it, where he says the issue with America as an experiment shows that it's kind of like a new phenomenon, which is the white worker betrays the Black worker because they put the white before the worker. And isn't that kind of an interesting way of saying it? Because in some ways, it's not even, he's not even talking about your Marxist view of class consciousness, but he's introducing the concept of, like, even when Eddie was describing the history of the development of Indian civilization by Indian people, the diversity, it's like, in some ways, it's amazing in a grotesque way that in America, that on what is supposed to be a new, like a pretty relatively new modern state, that the number one thing preventing the people from becoming a people is this invention, what seems like such a simple new invention of whiteness. Whereas like millennia of Indian civilization, you have peoples upon peoples interacting, like sometimes violently, sometimes not. But they through its diversity of religion and language, were able to develop in complex ways, essentially what we call now the Indian civilization. But anyways, I was kind of connecting it to even what Michelle was raising about Europe, because this whole question of like, why is there, even though you have so many white peoples, like why is there no vitality today? Because actually historically it is true, like Europe produced the Renaissance, right? So it's not like, oh, white people are just biologically like unable to produce culture. Like it's not a biological explanation, but in some ways the whole thing of where Baldwin says the issue with today is that the white worker is because the white worker puts the white before the worker. It's very Robesonian, Paul Robesonian, in that Baldwin is essentially saying that to put the white before the worker in some ways primes you to be unable to participate in civilization, if that makes sense. Like, and that you lose the folk behind, you lose the folk that would give you the ability to produce folk art, if that makes sense. So anyways, I was just trying to piece together.
Something super tiny.
Wait, I wanted to add to that because I think all of this, like the complexity of dealing with the question of civilization, especially today, because I mean, everything that I think Nuri also asked this question is, why is it that Western civilization or European civilization couldn't just have a lot of people from all over the world come in and become a part of it, but not And of course, we also talked about how immigrants and so on can assimilate to whiteness in a certain way, or the sort of benefits it affords you, but it's never in a way to become part of Western civilization in a way that can take forward Western civilization, or it can be renewed, or it can have some value for all humanity, right? And then to contrast it with what Eddie was bringing up about India, which is also what I was thinking about when we asked that question, is how is it that Islamic civilization, even after conquering such a vast tracts of what now is India, it is the conquerors who subverted their civilization, or whose civilization got subverted or assimilated into the civilization of the conquered. Like what? And that's, I think, where this thing of consciousness becomes so important. And even, I mean, you see that in America also. How is it that Black civilization is the only civilization worth talking about in this country also? How is it that all American people in some way do turn to that music, do turn to, in some ways, even the life world, even if they won't put it that way, the religion that way, right? So how is it that you have the opposite situation in those examples of the conqueror or the victor in some ways subverting their civilization to the civilization of the conquered? And then I feel like this is also why
were the conquered ever fully conquered?
that's it. Yeah, and I want
the defeat of Reconstruction. Was it really a defeat if the defeated never accepted a defeat? And they kept fighting. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I also wanted to bring up in that same vein this thing about why, when we talk about civilization today, it's a new conversation in the modern world, which is also what Nouri's article was pointing out, because colonialism and the colonial oppression of India was in some ways break with that history of assimilating cultures into an Indian culture, because the British were the first people who conquered with no interest in knowing, understanding, taking from, becoming Indian in any way, right? So that really was the break. And I think that changes everything. I think it removes the grounds on which civilization could be thought about before that period, before that almost shift, which I guess is connected to the global capitalism. It's connected to the slave trade. It's connected to the empire of cotton, all of that, making this shift, an axial shift. It changes the terms on which civilization questions could be addressed. And I think I would like to disagree slightly with what Shantanu was saying about Tagore and Shantiniketan. I mean, not in substance very much, but this thing of, I feel like what he was trying to do is not so much a synthesis of the East and Western modernity, but I think it was something completely new, a new moral, total education, a new humanistic education that actually tried to address what the modern man or woman would need in terms of education to become modern, and not tied to the West in any particular way. Because you have to remember, he was very big on focusing on languages, Indian languages also, and so on and so forth. So that's just one thing. But I say that to say that, like, this thing of both the history of consciousness being an essential part of understanding civilization, but then civilization also have necessarily needing to be addressed in modern terms, which I think were the two things I really...
You said he was very concerned with language. In what sense?
Well, I think he definitely put a lot of emphasis on Indian languages being taught and people creating art and literature and poetry.
But languages being preserved.
Preserved, and I mean...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. One last thing, which is that...
This is very important. Language is being preserved because the fullness of a civilization like India's cannot be understood without all of the component parts and elements of all of these 1,000 languages. That's all.
The one last thing is the other one of
what that means for pedagogy at a university. How, like Eddie said, there are languages that he asked Raju, well, what is that? He said, I don't know, that's not my language. So so this new kind of pedagogy where, where language And the study of languages begins literally in the kindergarten. Because, quote, man can't understand man in India if man don't understand other man's language. I'm using man generic. Language is such a foundation of whatever modern civilization India develops, rather than everything. Well, we're going to just use 25 accepted languages in a cultural civilization ecosystem with 1,000 languages. I'm sorry.
The only qualifying thing I would say to that is I feel like it's not to be underestimated that as part of the freedom struggle, there was also a conversation about a unifying language for the Indian people, which is
yeah.
And Tagore and Gandhi were part of this debate, But
Could you
I
just
feel
say
like
a little bit more about that?
well, you can go to any part of India, and even if people don't understand Hindi completely or speak it completely, I feel like it's not so that you cannot relate to one another.
But let me ask you this question. It's not, okay, everybody has a relation to Hindi, right?
Or at least like you would know some of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
But does everybody have a relationship to, quote, a lesser language? So is it a one way or is it, multiple, that you're not just asking me to understand Hindi, but I want you to understand Tamil Nadu or Bengali or, and I guess they're part of the 25 official languages, but even more modern languages.
Well, I guess my sense has been that an emphasis on regional languages and that fight over my regional language, why should it be subverted to Hindi, have usually emerged from reactionary forces. That don't see the freedoms.
Wait a minute, but hold it. But is it only a reactionary appropriation, or is it? See, the question becomes, if it is not solved, then you open the door to reactionaries to appropriate the question. For example, if I'll just say it again, shouldn't it be more than a one-way street? Because if I'm a native Hindi speaker, then that makes me feel superior or potentially superior to a person whose native tongue is not Hindi and only understands Hindi. I can understand what you're saying, but I can't express myself in that language.
I think I know. Can I say something?
Okay.
Well, this is an interesting thing because it's not to the extent that India has it, but China grapples with the same thing because China has a bunch of dialects. Earlier you mentioned Xinjiang, which like they speak the Uyghur language too, which is like more or whatever, like Turkic.
Yeah, Central
But the thing
Asian.
is, like, I think part of some of the challenges of the development of the western parts of China was because they didn't speak Mandarin, which was where a lot of the industries, like that would be the language that would be used at jobs, industries, like throughout the nation. And like oftentimes like trade within China or outside of China was in Mandarin. And so like part of the economic development of the western parts of China was in school using Mandarin so that students would be trained, could find jobs elsewhere as well. But and you do see with an area like Xinjiang, it's developed more where you go to Xinjiang, like internal tourism is a huge part of or something that China's working on. And people from like Shanghai, Beijing, or whatever that's visiting Xinjiang, the locals are able to communicate and sell goods, whatever it is. I think that's like one part. But then I guess what you're asking me is the other way around.
Yeah.
And I do think the Chinese state has made more cognizant efforts. Like in Xinjiang, the airport, you have like 3 different languages on every sign. One in Mandarin, one in the Uyghur, and I think the other was like Kazakh. The Kazakhs yeah,
Is it right on
there as well. And so it is two-way in the sense of like you having that universal language so that like the practicalities of life, you're able to communicate with one another or beyond your narrow community or group. But then like isn't language only important so as much as it serves the people, or any part
Isn't
language important in the sense that it serves the interests of the people?
Well,
Like it-
clearly.
Yeah.
And so you can't have a democratic, multi-civilizational state, especially India. India is the test case for this. Yeah, 1,000 languages. I mean, known languages in India. I mean, that boggles the mind. And I'd say this explains a lot of the intellectual, that the Indian brain is very complicated and complex because of the multiple languages that you're always hearing, even if you don't fully know them. But the language question is huge, even today. If you go to Rwanda, the split between the Hutu and the Tutsi was a linguistic split, a split between a Nilotic language and a Bantu language speaking people. The same thing. Yeah, just if we go through the linguistic history of humanity and its origins in Africa, 7 languages, but language may be one of the key questions of uniting the African continent. You know, very similar to India, same number of people and the same linguistic, and I'll just say this, forgive me if I'm Africa is the part of the world with the largest number of languages spoken. Of the 2,000 something languages, and I forget off the top right now, in the world, maybe, I'll say, maybe 40% of them are African are spoken in Africa. And then the question, what is an African language? What is an Asian language? And what are all the influences? But that's all I wanted to say, that it's just like everything else. Independence comes, you have to solve certain problems of the nation, you know, but then after those problems are solved, then we have these other more nuanced questions that have to be addressed.
Well, the only thing I was just gonna add to this is, like, I feel like this is an interesting conversation also in light of when you describe, Doc, like the record of failed color revolutions in China.
Yes.
Like, language has also been used by colonialism to like exacerbate those divides of the people. And I feel that maybe that's partly what I feel like the reaction, like the feeling that I get, like the simultaneous thing of like, I wish I there's actually a lot of linguistic diversity in China, so much so there is a lot of mutual unintelligibility between them, and yet some of them come from same language family, different language families. But then when like the Hong Kong people say like, oh, you're gonna come in here with your Mandarin supremacy, we need to preserve our Cantonese. It's like, well, half the time you guys are using British English. So like, I hate that. That's a stupid argument. But then it's also when the Uyghurs, armed with say Western propaganda, Western weapons of like also ideological natures of like, you know, they got some grant from like USAID to like preserve their culture and like emphasize Uyghur language. It's also to like fight back against, you know, Mandarin supremacy, but that's also coded for like actually accepting that they have a role to play in Chinese civilization. I would just say that I think it is important to continue to say like, maybe I think in India, I'm sure there's like a lot of appreciation of say Bengali music or like Tagore's poetry in Bengali, or maybe there's like regional, like I know regional like movies and stories and festivals are like even between like non-Hindi peoples within one another, like they're always interested. I think there's always a curiosity of like what the diversity of our culture, but where it becomes, I feel like dangerously like fragmentary and purposely, you know, divisionary is when like some kind of Western influence creeps in and is like, you don't need to belong to a big civilization. You need to either see yourself as cosmopolitan or this unique sectarian thing.
Yes.
And like civilization can actually be very hegemonic. Don't you not want to be part of a civilization and want to be more, maybe more Western, enlightened, and freed?
Right.
But like, so I don't know if I'm setting up too many dichotomies, but I just feel that, you know, taking into account the role that the West sees all this diversity, and then is like, you can then exploit that to weaken a civilizational process that's meant to be worked out among that people, how to relate in a new and modern and colored modern context. And to say like,
rooted in a freedom struggle.
yeah, rooted in a freedom struggle, but then to like kind of like slice that up and to be like, no, you guys can go back to being like people that are so easily broken down into tinier tribes so that we can come back in with our ideology. Like maybe the Hong Kong people should stay Cantonese and the Uyghur people should stay like Uyghur and not Chinese. Like there's a purpose behind that too.
That, I mean, that's it. No, that's the experience. I mean, we could relate to that here.
Yes,
You get the Afrocentrist
Yeah.
in the face of going forward and the problems of moving forward. People will say, well, let's go back into our own cultural tent. However, it does not, you know, by reactionaries taking it up, doesn't mean that it's not a problem that has to be addressed going forward.
Right.
And I can readily understand, you know, China has to solve the problem of extreme poverty.
Right.
Nothing, because if you don't solve that, Uyghurs and nobody else, Tibetans,
Oh boy.
you know, all gonna be doing, we all do bad together, you know. But to solve the outstanding, now, that's why I brought up the Maoist solution, which I mean, for the sake of conversation, because he did have a view of Chinese civilization, you know, and his view, like we say Reconstruction, the defeat of Reconstruction, he says the century of humiliation. The Opium Wars and all of that and that and that and that and that and that. So he looks back to that and says, and the Long March, of course, and the Japanese occupation. And he, you know, his soul, his consciousness is shaped by this direct experience with Chinese humiliation. That's a big word. I mean, in China, we don't use it here. But we could, but that's an emotionally charged, a century of humiliation of a great civilization.
Right.
It's for no reason that he called it the great proletariat cultural revolution. Why didn't he just call it the second proletariat revolution? Why did he throw culture in there? What was the point of it? You know? And of course, I'll just forgive me for talking.
No.
But you take Xi Jinping. You know, the West is always comparing Xi to Mao as against Deng Xiaoping, who was for openness and yada yada, you know, more like Gorbachev. But they compare Xi to Mao. In fact, they say Xi is more powerful than Mao. Probably he is. But what they're saying is, and this, Kathy, I get this from you, when you talk, when you say you go to China, China in civil society has a lot of security. You're not just going to run around there and do whatever you want to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You found it non-offensive. Remember,
There was a time I found it offensive.
There was a time you did, and
when I was younger, but then now I'm like, oh, I see why they're doing. I mean, I sympathize with it more.
Yes.
Even if it's a little inconvenient sometimes to carry on past.
And I thought I thought about it, and I said, what Kathy was saying, if this defends China against Western encroachment of its civilization, I bet you a dime to a dollar that the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, including Xi, are thinking the same thing. Okay, yeah, we got these cameras all around, but the fundamental defense of China is at the level of education. and culture. And so in a lot of ways, okay, we've come this far materially, but we're back to the questions raised by Mao, I would say in an incorrect way, in initiating the great proletarian cultural revolution. Mao, he wouldn't have had people wearing Western suits. They would have worn a Chinese, like they call them Mao suits, you know what I'm saying? And when Xi shows up, let's say to an anniversary of the Chinese Revolution with a Mao suit on, the West says, oh, he is rejecting the West. And by the way, Mao was associated with a hardcore racialist point of view vis-a-vis the white man.
Cat's dog too, is that what you said?
Yeah.
He says cat dog too?
He never went, I don't know if he went that far, but Mao was that kind of cat who, but anyway, I won't say more about it.
I just wanted to go back to Emily's earlier question, which is if whiteness poses the obstacle to class unity, should the call still be for class unity?
I said that?
No, Emily, Emily Eve.
Oh, sorry.
That's in part. That's in part what I interpreted the question.
I was like,
because in a way, it's like even when, like, let's say, like Marx and Engels introduced the idea of the proletariat, or reintroduced it, I guess. The whole point was that the proletariat is not purely a descriptive category. It's a category of consciousness. It is a class becoming a thing for itself. That's the whole point. It's like the working class becomes for itself and it becomes conscious of itself. And so in some ways, another way of approaching the question that I think you're raising is, what is the way that people become conscious for them, like conscious for themselves? And I'm not convinced that the end, either the rhetoric or the end result has to be simply class unity, like basically the working class becoming for itself. That was a hypothesis in some ways put forward by like Marx. And maybe actually what we're talking about of civilization could be an alternative, where civilization is also a self-conscious category. Does that make sense? Like in the ways that we talked about, like even like what was brought up, the whole point of civilization is you, as I said, you give up part of your own interest in order to become part of a larger whole. And even beyond civilization, another category that we brought up is the idea of all humanity, which is, does it change when people see themselves as part of the political subject of humankind, or the political subject of humanity as an agent of history? I think what we're ultimately interested in, how do the people become self-conscious agents of history? And that is really at the back of what even Marx was talking about when they were trying to get to this question of the proletariat as a global category of like people around the world becoming conscious of themselves as a united thing.
And so the whole becomes first, as opposed to the particular.
Yeah. And so that was just something that I thought about in terms of even like, but how we understand
the requirements for what Marx was saying are much higher today than they were when Marx said it. In other words, this is why civilization, and Nuri, this is why what you said is so valuable today. Once you look at all of this from the standpoint of civilization, you know, it looks different. What does class struggle look like from the standpoint of civilization? What does it look like? Is it the same thing as, for instance, the social democrats that run your union say? Everything is reduced to an economic. What, Nuri, I think, and what you're saying, Jerry, is that let's start with the primary, the whole. So
yeah, because the other I was reflecting on also the question of like why are people talking about civilization? Why did they talk about civilization in, let's say, the 1950s? And a lot of it was a sort of war, a sort of nuclear war. Nuclear war as a threat to human civilization itself. And so this becomes another starting point for the realization of a self-consciousness among, let's say, either the American people, the world's people, but it's like the prospect of the elimination, the extermination of whether it's individual civilizations, like let's say the example of like Israel basically trying to like exterminate all of like the people around it as a claim of its own civilization supremacy, or the elimination of world civilization itself. This then becomes the starting point for potentially the achievement of a consciousness that is able to grapple with and answer the challenge of that, like almost like world historic contradiction.
I think you're right.
Yeah, and that's really powerful. Thanks, Jeremiah. And yeah, I feel like what you're saying, what you just articulated, is sort of like what would replace this kind of like woke, anti-racist, like racial consciousness, that there has been lots of work done, right? Past few decades around how do white people become conscious of their whiteness, you know, all of this stuff, which tries to address the white worker problem, right? And tries to create the class unity, but it's not, right? Because race is a false construct. It's a non-thing, that consciousness isn't working. So we need a different kind of consciousness. Yeah, I love that.
Just, I was a little slow to respond to what we're talking about with the linguistic diversity, and yes, the necessity for man to know man and having a unified language, but also, I mean, it's really fucking incredible, really, the way that you have all these languages there, that which in part are many different ways of thinking and seeing the world emerging from that, and yet you have to my, you know, at least from the outside, a relatively coherent society and a oneness of people, and I think that points to a kind of consciousness as a people, and even as a government, and a level of governance that is able to deal with complexity. You don't have to impose this false uniformity that would amount to, let's say, extermination and extinguishment, and ultimately spiritual death. That I think whiteness as a way of bringing people in necessitates. And the reason why these places have been so generative, man. Indian, man, what fucking place, man. You had the Hinduism, and then you think, man, that's a lot, man. No, we're gonna do some more Buddhism. Let's go with the Buddhism. And then you know what? We can also deal with Islam. What's up? So just with the religions, right? And there's many more productions of India. I'm just keeping it simple right now. And so when you can deal with this kind of complexity, you have a more generative society that is able to understand the world as it is and move it forward and answer the problems that are facing humanity. And those problems are not just, oh man, let's just everybody like here. What you have problems facing humanity? Try to be white. That's your answer. You got a lot of existential problems as a young person in school. Just try to be white, man. I know you don't, but just try it. I guess consciousness and framework for civilization that can deal with this complexity.
That's what we're talking about.
It's like even if you have a major language and minor languages, let's say in India, and it's natural for a state to want to emphasize unity. I feel like, Doc, part of what you're raising is the possibility of cross-fertilization. Or like in both directions. Of like the hierarchy, like not the strict hierarchical thing, but
But from the standpoint of the formation of the state, it was practical for India to do what it did. 25 official languages out of a mix of 1,000. That is state formation. But now we're at a different stage, or entering a different stage. And it's not going to be, India is the test case. And although Africa does not have a single state, it has the linguistic diversity, which has been the source of civilizational conflict, even today in Rwanda and the Democratic Congo, across that border. who represents who and what is the link, you know, blase, blase, blah. So I'm just saying, this is a deep problem for one of the most important countries in the world going forward, India. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Maybe we should do comments or like the past two. Todd and Sparks, Raphael Kiliman say good morning. Sambala says, seems to me that the US is just an empire struggling to keep its head above water and willing to do whatever it takes. Steal, kill, borrow. Then said, Israel is a heavy weight on the world, has a colonial mentality, parading around with those white sheets.
Yep.
Then M. Sparks said, the New Monroe Doctrine is bringing capitalistic tyranny closer to the Western Hemisphere towards home. Bambalai says, Europe has become docile and hanging on to the American coattails for so many years. It's even emasculated. Observing the facts says, colonization is not civil. And then Fired Play says, thank you, Free School, for educating me. I am helping promote this HIV prevention medication in Nicaragua today, and I will be quoting James Baldwin. Thank you for coming. I just want to say a few words. This is their remarks. There was a writer in my country, James Baldwin, who said, the children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe. And I'm beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality. PrEP not only helps prevent HIV to those who take the medicine, it eliminates the risk of passing HIV to mothers and children. One of the things I love most about Nicaragua is that this country fights every day to protect the children of Nicaragua. And then Bambalai says, those who have no compassion for the children of others are neither civilized nor human. And then Magna said, it's so true about language being used to divide and conquer. The Dravidian language thesis that Tamil culture was fundamentally different than Sanskrit was propagated by a Scottish missionary named Robert Calvin. It seems to me linguistic divide and conquer is one way to stop people from investigating their common, universal, civilizational assumptions, like nonviolence. And then David Ball said, comrades, I believe that Mao understood the basic equation of identity equals strategy. Identity is strategy. That's why the Cultural Revolution was the greatest national self-esteem conflict resolution the world has ever seen, I think. Okay. That's why after a generation or so, according to Malcolm X, there are more, I think, more Uncle Toms in China. Weren't anymore Uncle Toms in China, which made China the baddest, most feared nation on this earth. And then I think they're saying, but that's all.
Okay, well, we will see you guys next week for another Free School. Thanks for commenting, and we look forward to continuing this very important discussion on civilization as well as logic and I forget the other topic. There's a yeah. So anyways, see you next week. Bye.